There is something beneath the ice that the oldest civilization on Earth left a warning about. Not a legend, not a story told to explain the cold or to frighten children away from the dark places at the edge of the map. A warning, specific, structured, repeated across separate cities by separate scribes who had no reason to agree with each other, pressed into clay and left in libraries that were already ruins before anyone had thought of Athens. The Sumerians were the first people we know of who wrote anything down. They invented the sentence. They invented the contract, the schoolroom, the ledger, the law code, the map. They were doing algebra while most of the species were still following herds. They divided the circle into 360 degrees and the hour into 60 minutes, and you used their arithmetic this morning without knowing whose it was. They tracked the movements of the sky with an accuracy that historians still find awkward to explain, because the precision implies records stretching back thousands of years further than the Sumerians themselves existed to keep them. And they left 7 warnings about the place beneath the ice, about what the ice is, about what it covers, about what happens on the day it stops covering it. The 4th warning is not ancient history. The 4th warning was confirmed last year in the peer-reviewed literature by scientists who had never read a cuneiform tablet in their lives and who were not looking for one. Before we get to the 7, you need to understand something about why you've never heard this. It is not because it's hidden. The tablets are catalogued. The translations are sitting in academic journals with library call numbers. Anyone who wants to read them can read them, today, for free. The information has been lying in the open for 140 years. The reason almost nobody engages with it seriously is a framework, a quiet set of assumptions about what ancient people were capable of noticing, about what a civilization could and could not have witnessed, about which categories of thing are permitted to exist. Those assumptions feel like plain common sense. They aren't. They're the inherited habits of one particular intellectual tradition, and they are standing between us and the oldest documents on Earth, telling us in advance what those documents must mean so that we never have to find out what they say. So set them down, just for the length of this. Read what the Sumerians actually wrote about what is under the ice. Hold it against what glaciologists and geophysicists and satellite gravimetry are reporting right now, and then decide for yourself what to make of it. Because the overlap does not come apart easily, and the 4th warning is no longer a question of interpretation. Here is the first thing to understand, and it is a fact of vocabulary, not of theory. The Sumerians had a word, Kur. Kur meant mountain. Kur also meant the foreign land, the country beyond the edge of the known world, the place your map stopped. And Kur meant the underworld, the realm of the dead, the region below, the destination from which nothing returns. Kur Nugia, the land of no return. Not 3 words that sounded alike. 1 word, 1 sign. A civilization that gave us the number system still running inside every clock in your house, looked at the mountain, the far country, and the land of the dead, and did not distinguish between them. To the Sumerians, these were not 3 ideas. They were 3 faces of a single thing, and the thing was cold, and it was distant, and it was down. Every serious scholar of Sumerian agrees on this. It is in the standard lexicons. It is taught in every introductory course on the language. It is not disputed, and it is not fringe, and it has been sitting there in the dictionaries the entire time. Now hold that beside a fact that is also not disputed. Under the East Antarctic ice sheet, buried beneath more than 2 miles of ice, there is a mountain range roughly the size of the Alps. It has peaks. It has valleys. It has, we now know, been carved by rivers. No human being has ever seen it. No human being ever will. We know it is there because we bounced radar off it. A mountain. A land beyond the edge of the map. A place from which nothing returns. 1 word. Let's go through the 7 in order, with the full weight of what they're actually saying. The first warning. The first warning comes from Nippur. Nippur was not a capital. It never had an empire, never fielded a great army, never produced a conquering king anyone remembers. It was something stranger and more important than that. It was the city every other city agreed to trust. Kings from rival states, at war with each other, would each make the journey to Nippur to be legitimized, because Nippur held the temple of Enlil, and Enlil's authority was the one thing in Sumer nobody was willing to fight about. The temple was called the Eker. It means the mountain house, not built on a mountain. There is no mountain in southern Iraq. The land there is flat alluvial floodplain for 100 miles in every direction, and it is worth stopping for a moment to sit with the fact that the most sacred building of the world's first civilization, raised on ground as flat as a table, was named for a mountain by people who lived nowhere near one. The scribal libraries of Nippur were excavated by expeditions from the University of Pennsylvania between 1888 and 1900. They pulled out somewhere in the region of 30,000 tablets, the single largest cache of Sumerian literary material ever recovered, and still the backbone of the field more than a century later. The collection was split. Roughly half went to Philadelphia, roughly half went to Istanbul. A smaller portion ended up in Jena, in Germany. It is still being translated. There are boxes in that collection that no one has read. Among the Nippur material is a body of text concerned with what Enlil kept in the mountain house, and one passage, in the plainest language the Sumerians ever used, the language of inventory, not of poetry, says this: "Beneath the Kur there is water that has forgotten the sky. It does not move, it does not freeze, it is kept. What is kept was put there by a hand, and a hand does not put a thing away forever." That is the first warning, entire. 4 lines. Water under the mountain that will not freeze, does not move, and is being kept. Here is why that matters. For most of the 20th century, the interior of Antarctica was understood to be the most straightforwardly dead place on the planet. Not hostile, dead. 2 miles of ice on top of bedrock at temperatures that fall past -80, in a desert that receives less precipitation than the Sahara. The scientific consensus was not that life there was rare. It was that the question was closed. There was nothing to look for because there was nowhere for anything to be. Then, in the 1970s, aircraft began flying radar surveys over East Antarctica, pulsing radio waves down through the ice and timing the return off the bedrock beneath. It works well. It is how we mapped a continent nobody can walk across. And over one particular stretch of the interior, near a Soviet research station called Vostok, the radar came back wrong. The return was flat. Not bedrock flat. Bedrock is never flat. Bedrock is broken and irregular, and it scatters the signal. This return was mirror flat, and it went on being mirror flat for 150 miles. There is exactly one thing in nature that reflects a radar pulse like that: the surface of standing water. It took until 1996 to publish the confirmation, in Nature. Beneath Vostok Station, under roughly 2.5 miles of solid ice, there is a lake. It is about 250 kilometers long. It is deep, over 1/2 kilometer in places. It is comparable in volume to Lake Ontario, and it had been sitting there in absolute darkness, sealed from the atmosphere, for somewhere on the order of 15 million years. Homo sapiens has existed for roughly 2% of the time that water has been shut in. Now hold the Nippur line against it. It does not freeze. Lake Vostok's water sits at approximately -3 degrees Celsius. It is below the freezing point of water, and it is liquid anyway. 2 mechanisms hold it there. The weight of the ice column above generates enough pressure to depress the freezing point, and from underneath, geothermal heat leaks up out of the bedrock. The lake is pinned in the liquid state between crushing pressure above and warmth below, a balance held for 15 million years that would collapse if either side of it changed. The Sumerians, on a floodplain, 4,500 years ago, wrote that the water beneath the mountain does not freeze. It does not move. Vostok is one of the most still bodies of water on Earth. There is no wind on it, because there is no surface, no tide, no rain, no rivers running in. Circulation is so slow it has to be inferred rather than observed. It is stillness of a kind that does not otherwise exist on this planet. It is kept. This is the line that should stop you, because it is not describing a state. It is describing an act, and an act implies an actor, and I want to be extremely careful here, so let me say plainly, I am not telling you someone put Lake Vostok there. I am telling you the Sumerian text uses a transitive construction, and that fact is not in dispute among people who read the language. The water is not being kept in the sense of merely persisting. It is being kept in the sense that a thing in a storeroom is being kept. And there is one physical property of that lake I have not mentioned yet. The water in Lake Vostok is supersaturated with oxygen. Estimates put it at something like 50 times the concentration you would find in ordinary surface water. The mechanism is understood. As the ice sheet grinds down over millions of years, gas trapped in the ice under enormous pressure is driven into solution at the base. It is not mysterious. It is just chemistry. But the result is that under 2.5 miles of Antarctic ice, in total darkness, there is a body of water with an oxygen content unlike anything else on the surface of the Earth. Whatever the reason, the effect is the same. A sealed vessel, held at the exact edge of freezing, charged with the one thing complex life cannot do without. In February 2012, after more than 20 years of drilling, a Russian team broke through. They had gone down about 3,168 meters, the longest ice core ever taken. When the drill head finally punched into the lake, the pressure differential drove water up the borehole in a column, hundreds of meters, where it froze. They went back the following season and cut that plug of frozen lake water out of the hole, and for the first time in 15 million years, somebody looked at it. What came back was contested, and it is still contested, and I am going to tell you both halves. A team at Bowling Green State University, led by Scott Rogers, sequenced the genetic material in those ice cores and reported something in the range of 3,500 distinct sequences. Most mapped to bacteria. Some did not map to anything, and a fraction of them, this is the part that got the attention, carried signatures more consistent with multicellular organisms than with microbes. Fungi, arthropods, things with cells that specialize. The objection came immediately, and it's a serious one. The Russians drilled that hole using kerosene and freon as drilling fluid, tens of thousands of liters of it, sitting in the borehole for 2 decades. Any sample retrieved through that column is a contamination argument waiting to happen, and the critics were not being unreasonable. The finding has never been cleanly replicated. It is not accepted. Rogers has defended the work, others have not been persuaded. So, unresolved. Genuinely, honestly unresolved. We opened a vessel that had been sealed since before our genus existed. We pulled out something that looked like it had been alive in there, and we cannot currently prove it wasn't our own drilling fluid talking. But notice what has already happened, regardless of how that argument ends. The consensus said, nothing is under there, and there is no point looking. The consensus was wrong about the water. It was wrong about the temperature. It was wrong about the oxygen. It was wrong about whether the place was worth a mission. Every one of those was overturned, and every one of them was overturned in the direction of there is more down there than we assumed, not less. We have since identified over 400 subglacial lakes beneath that ice. Not one, 400, connected, in places, by rivers. There is a hydrological system under Antarctica, moving water, drainage, flow, under a continent we described in textbooks as frozen solid. The first warning was not vaguely right. It was right about the specific thing we were most confident about and most wrong about, that stillness under the mountain meant nothing was there. We have not proven the rest of it. I want to be honest with you about where the line is. No Sumerian ever saw the South Pole. There is no ancient map of it, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. What there is a civilization that used a single word for the mountain, the far country, and the land of the dead, and then wrote that beneath that place lies water which does not freeze, does not move, and is being kept. And 2.5 miles under the ice, there it is, exactly as described, being kept. There is a part of the Vostok story that almost never gets told, and it belongs to a man named Andrei Kapitsa. Kapitsa was Russian geographical royalty. His father, Pyotr Kapitsa, won the Nobel Prize in Physics. Andrei went south with the Soviet Antarctic expeditions in the 1950s and 60s and did the seismic soundings, the hard, cold, unglamorous work of setting off charges in the ice and reading the echoes. And in the 1960s, looking at his own data, he proposed that there was liquid water under Vostok Station. Nobody believed him. It was not that they thought he was a fool. It was that the claim was absurd on its face. Liquid water at the coldest place ever recorded on the surface of this planet, Vostok holds the record, minus 89.2 degrees Celsius, set in 1983, was simply not a thing a serious person proposed. He was right, and he waited about 30 years to be told so. The Nature confirmation came in 1996, and he co-authored it. He died in Moscow in August 2011, 6 months before the drill finally broke through the roof of the lake he had found with dynamite and patience half a century earlier. He missed it by half a year. I mention this because the pattern is the whole point of this video, and here it is in miniature inside living memory with names and dates. A man says, there is water under the mountain. Everyone knows there is not. He is right. It takes 30 years. The Sumerians said it too. They have been waiting rather longer. There is a second detail from Vostok that deserves its own moment. When you drill down through the ice sheet, you are drilling through snow that fell from the sky, compressed over hundreds of thousands of years. That is the ice core record. That is the atmosphere in a column. But at Vostok, at around 3,738 meters down, the ice changes. It stops being snow. The bottom 200 meters or so of that core are not glacial ice at all. They are what is called accretion ice, lake water that has frozen onto the underside of the ice sheet from below. The crystal structure is different. The grains are enormous, some of them tens of centimeters across, because they grew slowly in still water, rather than being compressed out of snow. You can tell by looking. Which means the last stretch of that borehole was not drilling through sky. It was drilling through the lake, already frozen, hanging from the ceiling. The ice sheet is not simply sitting on the water. The two are exchanging. Water freezes onto the base at one end of the lake and melts off at the other, in a slow circulation that takes tens of thousands of years to complete a lap. The lid and the vessel are in a relationship. They are, in the most literal sense available, being maintained against each other, and that is why the drilling became a diplomatic problem. The Antarctic treaty system is one of the more remarkable things our species has managed. A continent set aside, no military activity, no mineral extraction, science only, signed at the height of the Cold War by people who agreed on nothing else. Under it, environmental protection is a serious legal obligation, and when the Russians made clear that they intended to penetrate a lake that had been sealed for 15 million years, other treaty parties objected in formal terms. The concern was not fanciful. Puncture the seal with a borehole full of kerosene, and you may contaminate irreversibly the most pristine environment on the planet, one that had been running its own experiment in the dark since before the Miocene. There is no undo. You get one chance at a 15-million-year-old sample, and if you spoil it, it is spoiled forever, for everyone, permanently. The drilling was paused, then argued about. Then a compromise was reached. The Russians would stop short of the water and then approach the final meters using a method meant to let the pressure differential push lake water up into the hole, rather than letting drilling fluid fall down into the lake. It half worked. The water did come up. And the samples are still contested, which is precisely what the objectors said would happen. So the record stands like this. We knew there was something kept under the mountain. We spent 20 years arguing about whether we had the right to open it. We opened it anyway, and what we pulled out is an argument we cannot settle. And then there is the lake nobody talks about, which is the one that actually answered the question. While the Russians were fighting over Vostok, an American project called Wizard was doing something quieter, and in the end, far more important. Their target was not Vostok. It was subglacial Lake Whillans in West Antarctica, a much smaller body, only about 2 meters deep, under roughly 800 meters of ice. Unglamorous. A puddle by comparison, but they went at it differently. No kerosene. They built a hot water drill, a system that melts its way down using the ice's own meltwater, filtered and sterilized and passed under ultraviolet light before it goes into the hole. Every instrument that entered the borehole was cleaned to standards borrowed from spacecraft assembly, because the people who worry about contaminating Europa and the people who worry about contaminating a subglacial lake are worrying about the same thing. In January 2013, they broke through cleanly. For the first time, a human instrument entered a subglacial Antarctic lake without dragging the surface world in with it. And the water was full of life. Not ambiguous signals, not sequences that might be contamination. A functioning ecosystem, on the order of 4,000 microbial species, at cell densities comparable to deep ocean water, published in Nature in 2014 and never seriously challenged since. Here is what makes it extraordinary rather than merely surprising. That ecosystem has no sunlight. It has not had sunlight in a very long time. Every ecosystem you have ever seen or eaten from runs at the bottom, on photosynthesis, on something converting light into sugar. Whillans does not. The organisms down there are chemosynthetic. They pull energy out of minerals, reduce nitrogen, iron, sulfur, methane, liberated from bedrock ground down by the ice sheet itself, and they are also working relict organic matter, left in marine sediments, from a time when that ground was sea floor. So the glacier is not just a lid. The grinding of ice on stone is part of what feeds them, and the rest is a buried ocean that stopped being an ocean before anyone was around to name it. Life, under the covering, sustained by the covering, in the dark, with no reference to the sun at all. That is not contested. That is not a fringe claim. That is a finding in nature. And in 2019, a follow-on project went into Mercer Subglacial Lake, further along the same ice stream, and found something odder still in the sediment: the remains of animals, crustaceans and tardigrades, not alive, but there, hundreds of kilometers from open water, under half a mile of ice. Carcasses of things with legs, in a place that is supposed to be a rumour. So when I told you the Vostok result was unresolved, that was true, and it remains true. But do not let that unresolved question obscure the resolved one. The question is there life under the Antarctic ice has an answer, and the answer is yes, and we have had it since 2014, and almost nobody outside the field knows. The consensus was that the interior was dead. The consensus was not slightly off. It was wrong at the root, about the most basic question available, and it was wrong in the direction of there is more down there than we assumed. The accretion ice deserves more than I gave it, because it is the closest thing we have to a message from inside the vessel. Remember what it is, not snow. The bottom stretch of the Vostok borehole is lake water that froze onto the underside of the ice sheet from below, and was then carried along hanging from the ceiling as the sheet crept across the lake. It is the lake's own signature, written on the lid. And when the Russians and their collaborators looked closely, the accretion ice was not one thing, it was two. The upper portion, call it the first type, is dirty. It carries sediment, mineral inclusions, rock flour, material that could only have been picked up where the ice was in contact with the bed. That tells you it froze on over a shallow shelf, an embayment at the lake's northern end where the water is thin and the ice is close to the bottom. The lower portion is different. It is clean, extraordinarily clean, some of the purest ice ever examined, with almost nothing in it at all, because it froze slowly out of deep, still open water far from any bed. The crystals in it are enormous, grains you can measure in tens of centimeters, because in water, that quieter crystal has all the time in the world to grow, so the ice records the shape of the lake it came from, shallow at one end, deep at the other, and the borehole read both as it went down. And in that ice, Sergei Bulat and colleagues at the Petersburg Nuclear Physics Institute spent years doing the most paranoid microbiology imaginable, working on the assumption that everything they found was contamination until they could prove otherwise, discarding almost everything, holding to a standard so severe that their published cell counts came out lower than anyone else's. What survived their filter was a very small number of sequences, and one of them, reported in 2013, did not match anything in the databases at all, an unclassified bacterium closest relatives unclear. Bulat's team were careful about it and remained careful. It was not a claim of a new kingdom of life. It was a sequence they could not place and could not dismiss. The interesting part is what it might imply about the bottom of that lake. Some of the signals that have come out of Vostok material look thermophilic, like organisms adapted to heat. And Lake Vostok sits in a rift basin, which is exactly the sort of place where geothermal activity can vent through the floor. If that is right, and it is not established, and I want to be clear about that, then the picture is not a cold, dark puddle. It is a body of water with heat coming up through the floor, oxygen coming down from the roof, and 15 million years of undisturbed time to see what those two things do to each other. That is the same recipe as a hydrothermal vent on the ocean floor, and hydrothermal vents are the leading candidate for where life on this planet started in the first place. We drilled into it, argued about the samples, and stopped. The British attempt is worth a moment too, because it is a reminder of what this costs. In December 2012, a team from the UK set out to drill into Lake Ellsworth, 3 kilometers down in West Antarctica. Years of planning, millions of pounds, equipment shipped to the bottom of the world and dragged inland. They were, by some margin, the best prepared of the 3 efforts running that season. The drill failed. A boiler problem, then a difficulty linking the main borehole to a cavity they had made to recirculate water, then falling behind, then running low on fuel with the season closing. The programme's principal investigator made the call to stop. They had gone about 300 metres. They packed up and went home, and it has not been reattempted. 3 teams went for 3 lakes. 1 failed outright. 1 got samples nobody can trust. 1 did it cleanly and found a world running on rock. What is kept was put there by a hand, and a hand does not put a thing away forever. The Nippur texts do not stop at the water. They are specific about what the water is kept in. And that structure, the thing that holds the vessel, has a name in Sumerian and a location in the peer-reviewed literature, and no human eye has ever seen it. We will need to talk about the mountain. The second warning. The second warning requires you to understand something about Enlil that is almost always left out of the popular treatments, because it is boring and because it does not fit the shape of the story people want to tell. When Enlil is mentioned at all outside the field, he is usually cast as the villain, the storm god, the one who wanted humanity drowned, the antagonist to Enki's benevolence. It is a tidy arrangement, and the Sumerians would not have recognized it. Enlil was not a personality. Enlil was an office. He held authority, and the Sumerians were relentlessly precise about the fact that authority had to be located. It had an address. It sat somewhere. It sat in the Akur, the mountain house, and Enlil's most common epithet, the one that appears again and again across the hymns, the one a Sumerian would have reached for first, was Kurgal, the great mountain. He was not the god of the mountain. He was not the god who lived on a mountain. The texts call him the Great Mountain, flatly as a name. The most powerful figure in the Sumerian world, worshipped on the flattest land in the known world, was called a mountain by people who would have had to walk for weeks to see one. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment, because it does not go away with familiarity. Scholars have offered explanations. Perhaps the Sumerians came from somewhere mountainous originally, and carried the vocabulary with them. Perhaps the ziggurat was an artificial mountain built to compensate for the absence of a real one. Perhaps it was pure metaphor, height meaning power, the way we say someone is elevated. All of these are reasonable, none of them are established. The honest position, and you will find it stated in exactly these terms in the scholarly literature, is that we do not know why the first civilization was organized around a mountain it did not have. The second warning comes from that same Nippur material, and from a parallel text recovered at Lagash, a different city, a different scribal tradition, several hundred kilometers away saying the same thing. That matters. Independent attestation is the thing that separates a quirk of one scribe from a shared belief, and this one is attested twice. The mountain beneath was not raised, it was covered. What is raised may be worn down by the sky. What is covered is kept from the sky, and it does not wear. The great mountain does not stand above, it waits below, entire. That is the second warning. The mountain under the covering does not erode, because the covering protects it, and so it is still whole. Here is why that matters, and I want to build this carefully, because the science on this one is genuinely remarkable, and almost nobody outside geophysics knows it happened. In 1958, during the International Geophysical Year, a Soviet expedition dragged seismic equipment into the deep interior of East Antarctica, one of the most punishing field operations ever attempted, into terrain with no landmarks, at altitude, in cold that kills equipment before it kills people. They set off charges and listened to the echoes to work out how far down the rock was. What came back said the rock was not where it should be. Under thousands of meters of ice in the dead center of the continent, there was a mountain range, not hills, a range, roughly 1,200 kilometers long, with peaks reaching something like 3,000 meters. Comparable in scale to the European Alps, utterly invisible, buried under as much as 4 kilometers of ice, in a place no one had any reason to expect a mountain at all. They named it after the expedition's leader, the geophysicist Grigory Gamburtsev, the Gamburtsev subglacial mountains. They are sometimes called the Ghost Mountains, and the name is not a flourish. Nobody has ever seen them. Nobody will. Every image you have ever encountered of them is a computer's inference from returned radar. And from the moment they were found, they were a problem. Mountains are not permanent. This is the part people find counterintuitive, and it is the entire crux of this segment, so let me be slow about it. A mountain range is not a thing. It is an event. It is what happens when tectonic forces push rock upward faster than weather can tear it down. The instant that pushing stops, the arithmetic reverses. Rain, wind, ice, and gravity begin dismantling it, and they do not stop. Left alone, without ongoing uplift, a range the size of the Alps is reduced to rolling nothing in a few tens of millions of years. The Appalachians were once Himalayan. Look at them now. So a mountain range implies recent tectonic activity, and recent tectonic activity should be visible. There should be faults, there should be volcanism, there should be a plate boundary somewhere. The Gamburtsev sit in the middle of one of the oldest, coldest, most tectonically dead pieces of continental crust on the planet. The East Antarctic craton has not done anything interesting in an extremely long time. There is no boundary there. There is no volcanism. There is no engine. There was no reason for those mountains to exist and every reason for them to have worn away long ago. And they were sitting there anyway at full height, in the dark. The problem sat unresolved for 50 years because you cannot investigate what you cannot reach. Then, during the International Polar Year of 2007 to 2009, an international consortium mounted an operation called AGAP, Antarctica's Gamburtsev province. Aircraft from multiple nations flew grid patterns over the range for a full season, carrying ice-penetrating radar, gravimeters, and magnetometers, working out of temporary camps in a place where a mechanical failure is a fatal event. They mapped it, and what the radar drew was the most surprising possible answer. The Gamburtsevs are not worn down. They are not rounded stumps. They are jagged. They have sharp alpine peaks. They have deep V-shaped valleys, and V-shaped valleys are the signature of running water, of rivers, cutting downward over long spans of time. There are cirques, the bowl-shaped hollows that early glaciers carve near summits. It is the topography of a young, living mountain range, preserved in full detail under 4 kilometers of ice. The resolution the AGAP teams and their successors converged on is subtle, and it is beautiful, and it is, in a way the Sumerian scribes could not possibly have anticipated, exactly what the second warning says. The Gamburtsevs are old. Their roots are ancient, 1 billion years perhaps in the crust beneath. There seems to have been a later episode of uplift, hundreds of millions of years ago, that raised them again. Rivers went to work on them and cut the valleys. Small glaciers formed in the high ground and carved the cirques. And then, roughly 34 million years ago, Antarctica froze. The ice came, and it did not grind the mountains away. It did the opposite. Because the interior is so cold and so dry, the ice at the base of the sheet in that region is frozen onto the bedrock. It does not slide. It does not scour. It is not a rasp. It is a cast. The ice sealed the range mid-life, at the exact moment of its last living shape, and then held it there, unweathered, unrained on, untouched by any atmosphere at all, for 34 million years. They are not preserved despite the ice. They are preserved because of the ice. What is raised may be worn down by the sky. What is covered is kept from the sky, and it does not wear. I want to be careful with what I'm claiming, so let me draw the line clearly. That is a statement about erosion. Erosion is not an exotic idea. Any farmer watching a hillside disappear over a lifetime understands the principle, and the Sumerians were, above everything else, agriculturalists on a floodplain. People whose entire civilization was built on silt that had eroded off mountains upstream and been carried down to them. They knew what the sky does to stone. They watched it arrive in their fields every year. So, no, I am not telling you a Sumerian scribe knew about the Gamburtsev subglacial mountains. Here is what I am telling you. That scribe wrote that the great mountain is not the one standing in the light, that the real one is below, covered, and that the covering is why it is still whole. He wrote it on a plain with no mountains, about a god he called the Great Mountain, in a temple he called the Mountain House. And when we finally found a mountain range that was covered, the reason it was still whole was the covering. The correspondence is not in the physics. The physics is ordinary. The correspondence is in the shape of the thought. The idea that concealment is not decay, but preservation. That being covered is not the end of a thing. That what is under the cur is not gone. It is intact. Everything in the Sumerian arrangement points downward and inward, toward the notion that the world above is the copy, and the world below is the original. We tend to read that as primitive superstition, as fear of the dark dressed up in theology. Then we flew radar over the dead center of the coldest place on Earth and found a perfect, unweathered, river-carved mountain range that has been sitting there in original condition since before there were primates. The geology of the Gamburtsevs deserves more than a mention, because the resolution took 50 years, and it is one of the better detective stories in the earth sciences. Here is the problem in its sharpest form. To build a mountain, you need to thicken crust. You need something pushing. The standard machinery for this is continental collision. Two plates meet, the crust crumples and doubles up, and the thickened root floats higher, the way a thicker block of wood floats higher in water. That is the Himalayas. India is still driving into Asia, and the mountains are still going up. East Antarctica has not collided with anything in an extraordinarily long time. It is the interior of an ancient craton, some of the oldest continental crust on Earth, welded together and then left alone. There is nothing pushing. There has been nothing pushing for a span of time that makes the word ancient feel inadequate. And yet the AGAP surveys found a crustal root under the Gamburtsevs, thickened crust, reaching down perhaps 50 to 60 kilometers, exactly the sort of structure a mountain range needs to stand on. The reconstruction that emerged, published in Nature in 2011 by Ferriccioli and colleagues, runs something like this. About 1 billion years ago, in the assembly of an earlier supercontinent, there was a collision, and it built a range, and it built the root. Then time did what time does, and the mountains above wore away to nothing. But the root stayed. Roots are buoyant, and they are stubborn. Then, somewhere in the region of 250 million years ago, as the supercontinent Gondwana began pulling itself apart, a rift opened right along the old suture, because rifts follow old weaknesses, the way a cracked plate breaks along the crack. The rifting reheated the root, it thickened again, and the old dead range came back up, a mountain range that rose twice hundreds of millions of years apart from a root 1 billion years old. Then rivers cut into it. Then small glaciers formed in the high valleys and carved cirques. And then, about 34 million years ago, the ice arrived and stopped the clock. Everything in that account is inference. We have not touched the rock. Every word of it comes from radar returns, gravity readings and magnetic anomalies measured from aircraft flying grids at altitude over the emptiest place on Earth. Nobody has held a piece of the Gamburtsev Mountains. There is no sample. There is no photograph. There will not be one in your lifetime or in anyone's. And I want to say something about what it took to get even that much, because we are very casual about the word survey. AGAP ran out of 2 temporary camps in the deep interior of East Antarctica, at altitude, in the field season, in conditions where a mechanical failure is not an inconvenience but a death. The aircraft were flown by crews, doing grid patterns for hours at a stretch over terrain with no features, no landmarks, no horizon you can trust, white on white on white. Fuel had to be flown in and cached in advance. Everything that went in had to come out. The temperatures degrade the machines before they degrade the people, and the people are not doing well either. Dozens of scientists and support staff from multiple countries spent an entire season of their lives, and something in the region of tens of millions of dollars of public money, to produce a map of a mountain range that no human being will ever visit. They did it because it was there and because we did not know. That is the entire justification, and I think it is a sufficient one. What they came back with is a portrait of a landscape that has been held, unweathered, at the exact moment of its last living shape, for a span of time in which the entire primate order came into being. The Sumerians, who could not have known any of this, wrote that the mountain beneath does not wear because it is covered. There is a day in the history of this planet that the second warning is really about, and it is worth knowing when it was and what happened. For most of the age of the dinosaurs, and for a good while after, Antarctica was not frozen. It was forested. There were trees, southern beech, conifers, ferns. There were dinosaurs living on it. Later, there were marsupials. It sat where it sits now, at the bottom of the world, and it was green, and it had seasons, and things lived out their whole lives on it. Then, at the boundary between the Eocene and the Oligocene, about 34 million years ago, the ice came, not gradually. The record, from ocean sediment, from oxygen isotopes in the shells of foraminifera, shows a step. A relatively sharp transition into a glaciated world, geologically fast, after tens of millions of years of warmth. 2 things seem to have done it, and the way they interact is the point. The first is geography. Antarctica had been attached to the other southern continents, part of Gondwana, and it was slowly being left behind as the others moved away. Somewhere around this period, the Drake Passage, the gap between the Antarctic Peninsula and South America, opened properly, and Australia finished separating from it. And once there was clear water all the way around the continent, a current formed, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, the largest current on Earth, running clockwise around the whole thing with nothing to stop it. That current is a wall. It cuts Antarctica off from the warm water of the north. It puts a moat around it thermally, and everything inside the moat gets colder than it would otherwise be. The second is carbon dioxide. Through the same period, atmospheric CO2 was falling, from levels far above anything modern down toward a threshold, and modelling suggests there is a threshold, a level below which, given the geography, the ice becomes not just possible but inevitable, and once it starts it feeds itself, because ice is white and reflects sunlight, and therefore makes more ice. So the country was shut by two things at once, an ocean that closed around it, and an atmosphere that thinned out its blanket. Somewhere in there, on some particular autumn, snow fell on high ground in the Gamburtsev valleys and did not melt the following summer. That is the day. Nobody was there. Nothing recorded it except the sediment on the ocean floor and the shape of the rock under the ice. Everything alive on that continent died, or left, or was already gone. The forests went. The rivers that carved the valleys under the Aurora Basin stopped running and the water in them froze where it stood. And then the ice thickened over the top of all of it and sealed it. And it has been sealed since. 34 million years. The Alps did not exist yet. The Himalayas were still going up. There were no grasslands to speak of, no great apes, nothing you would call a monkey doing anything interesting. Then the cold came down and the country was shut. Not drowned, shut. And here is the part that makes it a warning rather than a fact. The mechanism that shut it is not a one-way door. The circumpolar current is still running. But the other half of the pair, the carbon dioxide, the thing that fell below a threshold and let the ice form, is not falling anymore. It is going the other way, fast, and we are the reason. The covering was created by a set of conditions. We are deliberately and measurably unmaking one of those conditions. And there is one more thing in the AGAP data that I have not mentioned. The Gamburtsevs are almost certainly where the East Antarctic ice sheet started. When the climate crossed the threshold 34 million years ago, the first ice would have formed in the high valleys of that range. Small glaciers in the cirque, exactly like the Alps today. Those glaciers grew and merged and spread outward and downward until they had covered the range that birthed them, and then kept going, and did not stop until they had covered a continent. The mountain made the covering, then the covering swallowed the mountain, and the water from Warning 1 is not somewhere else. Lake Vostok lies in the same East Antarctic interior, in a rift basin, in the shadow of that buried range. The vessel and the mountain that holds it are the same story. The Sumerians said something is kept beneath the mountain. There is a mountain. There is something kept beneath it. But a mountain that has never been touched by weather, in a place that has never been visited, raises a question the second warning does not answer, and the third warning does. And the third warning is the one where this stops being about geology, because the Sumerians claim that somebody drew a map of it. The third warning. The third warning is the one where I have to be most careful with you, and I would rather tell you that up front than have you catch me at it later. There is a version of this segment that would be very easy to make. It involves a famous map, a dramatic claim, and a conclusion that would feel extremely satisfying. That version is also, on the best available evidence, wrong. And I am going to walk you through why it's wrong, because the thing that survives the debunking is stranger than the claim. Start with the Sumerian text, because the Sumerian text is not in dispute. Among the most extraordinary documents the civilization produced is a composition modern scholars call Inanna and Enki. It survives on tablets from Nippur. In it, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu, gets Enki drunk and persuades him to hand over the Me. The Me are the hardest concept in Sumerian thought to translate, and the field has never settled on a word. They are usually rendered as divine decrees, which is unhelpful. What they actually are is closer to the components of civilization itself, treated as physical, transferable objects, and the text lists them. It just lists them, one after another for lines and lines, kingship, priesthood, truth, the descent into the underworld, carpentry, metalwork, the scribal art, music, law, sexual intercourse, prostitution, the kindling of fire, the extinguishing of fire, deceit, fear, strife, weariness. It is an inventory of everything a society is made of, sacred and profane, jammed together with no distinction, because to a Sumerian they were the same category of thing, the parts, and the emi are never invented. This is the point that matters, and it is the point that gets missed. Nowhere in Sumerian literature does anybody figure out carpentry. Nobody discovers law. The emi are given. They are handed over. They come from Enki, from the Abzu, already finished, already whole. Human beings do not develop civilization in the Sumerian account. They receive it. The relevant lines of the third warning run, "What is given whole was made elsewhere. The hand that receives does not know the hand that made. Copy the copy and the copy remains true. The maker is not in the copy. Look for the maker beneath." That is the third warning. Knowledge arrives complete, from a source the receiver cannot see, and the copy carries no trace of where it came from. Now, here is the map. In 1929, during the conversion of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul into a museum, a curator working through the archives found a piece of gazelle-hide parchment. It was a fragment of a world map. It was signed and dated, Piri Reis, 1513. Piri Reis was a real man about whom we know a great deal. He was an Ottoman admiral, a serious navigator, and the author of the Kitab-ı-Bahriye, a book of sailing directions good enough that it is still studied. He was executed in his 80s by the Ottoman state over a military disagreement. He was not a mystic. He was a professional. His map shows the Atlantic. It shows the coast of Europe and Africa on one side and the coast of South America on the other, at a date only 21 years after Columbus. And along the bottom, running east, it shows a landmass. Piri Reis wrote notes directly on the map, in the margins, explaining his method. He says, and this is his own account, not somebody's theory about him, that he did not survey any of this himself. He says he compiled the map from roughly 20 older source maps. He says some of them were Portuguese. He says one of them was a chart he obtained from a sailor who had been with Columbus. And he says some of the sources went back to the age of Alexander. Those source maps do not exist. Not one of them has ever been found. In 1966, an American academic named Charles Hapgood published a book called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. Hapgood was a history professor, not a fringe figure. He taught at Keene State College, and Albert Einstein had written a foreword for an earlier book of his. Working with his students and later with cartographic staff at a US Air Force reconnaissance squadron, Hapgood analysed the Piri Reis map and concluded that the landmass along the bottom was not South America. He concluded it was Antarctica, and more than that it was the coastline of Queen Maud Land as it would look without ice. You can see the appeal. Antarctica was not sighted by anyone until 1820. Its subglacial coastline was not mapped until the seismic surveys of the 20th century. If a 1513 map compiled from ancient sources shows the shape of the rock under the ice, then somebody charted that coast before the ice arrived, and the entire timeline of human civilization is wrong. It is a magnificent claim. And I have to tell you that the field does not accept it, and that the reasons are good. The cartographic consensus is that the southern landmass is South America. 16th century mapmakers, working on irregular pieces of hide with no consistent projection, routinely bent coastlines to fit the material. And there is a visible point on the map where the South American coast turns and runs east, along the bottom edge, precisely where the parchment runs out. What Hapgood read as a separate continent, most cartographers read as Brazil, folded sideways to fit the page. Hapgood's fit to Queen Maud Land required rescaling and rotating sections of the map independently, which is the kind of operation that can make almost any shape resemble almost any other shape. The map also contains errors. The Caribbean is misplaced, there are duplicated landmasses that are hard to square with access to a superior lost source, so the exciting version is not supported. I am not going to sell it to you. If you have seen this map presented as proof of an ice-free Antarctic survey, you have seen an argument that does not survive contact with the specialists. Here is what survives. Piri Reis, in 1513, wrote on his own map that he had compiled it from around 20 older charts, including material he believed came from antiquity. That is not a modern interpretation. That is the primary document in his handwriting, telling us his method, and every single one of those sources is gone. Think about what that actually means without any Antarctica in it at all. A working Ottoman admiral had in his possession, 500 years ago, a shelf of maps old enough that he considered them ancient. He used them. He said so. He drew a new map out of them, and the new map is the only reason we know the old ones ever existed. The originals were lost, to fire, to damp, to war, to time, to the ordinary indifference that consumes almost everything anyone has ever written down. We have the copy, we do not have the maker. What is given whole was made elsewhere. The hand that receives does not know the hand that made. This is not exotic. It is the ordinary condition of nearly all human knowledge, and we simply do not notice it. Consider that you know the earth goes around the sun. Can you demonstrate it? Could you, from your own observations, without looking anything up, derive it? Almost certainly not, and neither could I. We received it whole. We are copying a copy, and the copy remains true, and the maker is not in it anywhere. The Sumerians noticed this. That is the thing I want you to take from the third warning. 4,500 years ago, the first people who could write anything down looked at their own civilization, at their mathematics, their astronomy, their law, and instead of taking credit for it, they said, "This was handed to us, finished, and we do not know by whom." We call that mythology. We file it under religion and move on. But look at the Piri Reis map, which is not mythology, which is a physical object in a museum in Istanbul. It is a document that exists only as an assemblage of vanished sources. It is a copy that is true and a maker who is gone. In 1513, an admiral held ancient knowledge in his hands, used it, wrote down that he had used it, and then those sources fell out of the world completely and permanently. That happened. That is not disputed by anyone. If it happened once, in the well-lit, well-documented 16th century, with a named man and a surviving artifact, how many times did it happen in the dark? It is worth spending another minute on Hapgood, because the way this story is usually told does him a disservice in both directions. Charles Hapgood was not a crank in the ordinary sense. He was a Harvard-trained historian teaching at a small New England college, and his method, assigning students a genuinely open problem and working it with them over years, is the kind of thing we say we want from teachers. He corresponded with Albert Einstein about an earlier theory of his concerning crustal displacement, and Einstein wrote a foreword to that book. Einstein did not endorse the theory, read what he actually wrote, and it is a model of careful courtesy. He found the idea arresting. He was not qualified to judge the geology. He thought it deserved examination by people who were. That is a scientist being decent to an amateur. It has been repackaged ever since as Einstein believed this, which is not what happened, and Hapgood is not to blame for what other people did with it after he died. The Piri Reis analysis went further than a book. Hapgood and his students wrote to the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron of the US Air Force at Westover Base, people whose actual job was cartography and photo interpretation, and asked them to look. And a reply came back over the signature of a lieutenant colonel saying that the lower portion of the map appeared to agree with the seismic profile of the subglacial coastline of Queen Maud Land. That letter is real. It gets quoted constantly, and it is not a forgery. It is also, on inspection, considerably less than it is made to sound. It was a courteous response from serving officers doing an interesting favour for a professor, not a peer-reviewed finding. They were not specialists in 16th century cartography. They were comparing a shape to a shape, which is exactly the operation that human beings are worst at doing objectively, because our pattern-matching apparatus does not have an off switch. The cartographers who have examined the map since have been consistent, and their case is technical rather than rhetorical. 16th century compilation maps are assembled from Portolan charts, each with its own scale and rows, stitched together by hand. Distortion is not a flaw in these documents. It is a structural property of how they were made. The southern landmass runs east along the bottom edge precisely where Piri Reis ran out of hide, and Hapgood's fit required rotating and rescaling separate sections independently, which, done with enough freedom, will fit nearly anything to nearly anything. There is also the small matter that the map is wrong in places it should not be if it had access to superior lost sources. The Caribbean is misplaced. There are landmasses that appear to be duplicated. A map drawing on a lost survey of the Antarctic bedrock ought to be better than this about the parts of the world people had actually been to. So the claim fails. I have now given you the case for it as strongly as its own advocates ever put it, and it still fails, and I think you should know that I know that. Here is what does not fail. Piri Reis wrote a book. It is called the Kitab-ı-Bahriyeh, the Book of Navigation, and it exists in multiple manuscript copies, in libraries you could visit. It is a working sailing manual. Harbours, currents, hazards, landmarks, the practical knowledge of a man who had spent his life at sea and wanted the next generation not to drown. It is detailed and sober and unmystical. In it, and in his marginal notes on the map, Piri Reis tells you his sources. He's not coy. He names what he had. He describes maps from the age of Alexander. He describes a chart from a sailor who had sailed with Columbus. He mentions maps of the Indies and China. He is doing what any careful compiler does, showing his working, and of that entire library, we have nothing, not one sheet. The Columbus chart is gone. The ancient maps are gone. Every source that Ottoman admiral held in his hands and drew from and credited by name has left the world entirely, and the only evidence they ever existed is that a man made a copy and the copy survived. That is not a theory. That is the ordinary, catastrophic, unremarkable way that human knowledge disappears. Think about the numbers for a moment. The Library of Alexandria is famous because it burned, but the far larger loss is the one nobody memorializes. The slow attrition, the damp cellar, the recycled parchment, the fire nobody wrote about, the last copy of something crumbling in a storeroom while the person who could have read it died of something ordinary. We have perhaps a few % of the literature of classical Greece. We have essentially none of what Carthage wrote. Of the 30,000 tablets from Nippur, a great many have never been read, and the number of living human beings who can read Sumerian fluently is smaller than the staff of a single hospital. The Sumerians looked at their own civilization and said, "This was given to us whole, and we do not know by whom. We look at ours and assume we built it, because we cannot see the gaps. But the gaps are the normal condition. Piri Reis is the proof, and Piri Reis is only 500 years old and extremely well documented, and his sources are still gone." I have to come back to Enheduanna because I told you she was the first author and then moved on, and what actually happened to her is the third warning with a face on it. The Exaltation of Inanna is not a general-purpose hymn. It is a document written by a woman in serious trouble. What we can reconstruct is roughly this. Her father Sargon died. The empire he had assembled began doing what empires do, and there was a revolt in the south. A man the text calls Lugal-Aini took and Enheduanna, the high priestess, the emperor's daughter, the living guarantee of Akkadian authority over the holiest office in Sumer, was driven out of her own temple. She says so in the poem. She describes being expelled, being made to walk out, being driven into exile like something swept from a room. She describes the loss of her office. There is a line where she says her ritual purity, the thing that made her what she was, has been taken and handed to someone else. And in that state she writes, she does not appeal to her family, she does not appeal to the moon god, whose priestess she actually was. She goes over everyone's head and appeals directly to Inanna, the goddess of the 7 gates, the one who goes down into the Kur and comes back, and the poem is an argument. It is a case made in the strongest language a human being had yet developed, that Inanna's power is supreme, and that the goddess should therefore intervene on her behalf. And in the middle of it she does the thing nobody had done. She names herself. She says, in effect, "I am Enheduanna. Let me speak. This is me." 4,300 years ago, in the middle of a religious text, in a genre that had always been anonymous, a person stepped out from behind the words and said, "I." She wrote other things. There is a collection called the Temple Hymns, 42 hymns, one for each of the major temples across Sumer and Akkad, a systematic literary survey of the sacred geography of a whole civilization. It is an astonishing act of organization. She is taking a conquered patchwork of rival cities, each with its own god and its own grudges, and arranging them into a single body of literature. And at the end of the temple hymns there is a colophon. It says that the compiler of the tablet was Enheduanna, and it says, this is the line, that something has been created here that no one has created before. The first author in the history of the world signed her work and then claimed originality, in the same breath, on the same tablet. Now, here is the part that has never left me. In 1927, Leonard Woolley, the same Woolley who dug the Royal Cemetery at one of the great excavations in the history of archaeology, found a disc, alabaster about 26 centimeters across, broken into pieces. On it is carved a scene, a ritual, a libation being poured, a procession, and a woman standing among them in the elaborate headdress of a high priestess, clearly the central figure. It is Enheduanna. Her name is on the back. The disc had been smashed, not eroded, not broken by the ordinary collapse of a building over 4,000 years. Woolley, who dug it up, examined the pick marks himself and concluded the damage was deliberate, that somebody had taken a tool to it in antiquity, on purpose, and then let the pieces go into the fill. Somebody wanted the object gone. Not the memory of her particularly. The old Babylonian scribes were still copying a text off it centuries later, which means a copy survived the smashing. Just this specific stone, in this specific place, ended by someone with a tool and an intention we cannot recover. And here is the strange mercy in it. The flake carrying her head broke clean. It survived, unweathered, separate from the rest, and when Woolley's team reassembled the disc, they found it and set it back in place. Her face is not gone. Go to the Penn Museum, in the same building as the 30,000 Nipper tablets, the same building where Kramer sat for 60 years, and you can look directly at her. The profile, the crown, the braided hair, restored to where it always was. I should say plainly that not every scholar agrees these hymns are hers in the way we would mean it today. The attribution is argued on linguistic grounds by people who read this language for a living. What is not argued is that a woman by this name existed, held this office, and was carved into this stone, and that somebody later tried to destroy the stone and failed. What is given whole was made elsewhere. The hand that receives does not know the hand that made. The Sumerians told us the maker is not in the copy. They were right, and they were right because of people like whoever held that chisel. The anonymity of the ancient world is not always time and accident. Sometimes it is somebody's decision. Sometimes there was a name and a face and a person, and someone came along afterwards and took the face off and let the rest stand. We have her words because children copied them for centuries in schools, mechanically, as an exercise, long after anyone remembered who she was. That is why she survived. Not reverence, homework. Everything else in this video comes to you the same way. Through accident, through drudgery, through the disc that broke into pieces instead of dust, through Woolley happening to dig that square meter, through Kramer taking the train to Istanbul. Look for the maker beneath. She is under there. Most of them are. There is one more thing about Sumerian authorship that I have to tell you, because it bears directly on the third warning, and because it is, on its own terms, one of the most remarkable facts in the history of our species. The first author in human history, the first person we can name who signed their writing and said, "I made this," was a woman. Her name was Enheduanna. She was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, and her father installed her as high priestess of the moon god at Ur around 2300 BC. That was politics. He had conquered Sumer, and putting his daughter in the most sacred office in the south was a way of holding it. Whatever the motive, what she did with the position was not political. She wrote, and she put her name in the text. Her most famous composition is called the Exaltation of Inanna, and it is a hymn to the same goddess who goes down through the 7 gates. It survives on a large number of copies, which is itself the tell. Students were copying it in scribal schools centuries after she died, which means it had become a classic. And in the middle of it, she does something no one had ever done. She breaks the frame and speaks about herself. She names herself. She describes being driven out of her temple, in exile, in trouble, appealing to the goddess. There is no earlier example of a human being doing this. Before Enheduanna, texts are anonymous. They come from the tradition, from the office, from nowhere. She is the first person in the recorded history of the world to stand behind a piece of writing and say, "This one is mine," 4,300 years ago. Before Homer, before the Hebrew Bible, before the alphabet existed, and most people have never heard her name. Now put that beside the third warning, because I think it is the sharpest possible illustration of it. The Sumerians said knowledge arrives whole and the maker is not in the copy. Their own civilization is the proof. Anonymous hymns, anonymous mathematics, anonymous law, arriving from nowhere, credited to gods because there was nobody to credit. And then one woman, once, put a name on something, and the name survived by accident, on school copies, because children were made to write it out. She is the exception that shows you the scale of the rule. For every Enheduanna there were thousands who wrote and are simply gone, not lost, not destroyed, just never named in the first place. The scribes of Nippur who copied the 7 warnings did not sign them. We have their handwriting and we do not have their names, and we never will. The hand that receives does not know the hand that made. Somebody made this. Somebody sat down 4,500 years ago and pressed these particular words into wet clay with a cut reed, and then set it aside to dry. A person. with a name and a family and a bad back from sitting and opinions about their supervisor. We have the clay. We do not have them. The Sumerian said, "Look for the maker beneath." And the fourth warning is where we look, and where, last year somebody found something. The fourth warning, the one that was confirmed. This is the warning that stops being interpretation and becomes a citation. Everything I have told you until now has required something from you. It has required you to hold a Sumerian line beside a scientific fact and decide for yourself whether the resemblance means anything. That is a reasonable thing to ask, and it is also, I recognize, the kind of exercise where a person can talk themselves into almost anything if they want it badly enough. The fourth warning does not work like that. The fourth warning makes a specific claim about what is beneath the ice. That claim was untestable for the entire history of the human species, and then, in 2023, a team at Durham University tested it, published the result in Nature Communications, and the answer came back yes. They were not looking for a Sumerian tablet. They had, I'm confident, never read one. That is what makes it worth your time. Start with the text. The fourth warning is the longest of the 7, and it comes from Eridu. Eridu matters more than any other city in this story. The Sumerian King List, one of the strangest documents ever recovered, a genuine artifact held at the Ashmolean in Oxford, opens with a line that has been rendered in English many times and always lands the same way. When kingship first came down from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Not a city was founded at Eridu, the first one. The Sumerians, who were meticulous record keepers and litigious about precedents, held as a matter of settled fact that Eridu was where civilization began. It was Enki's city. It sits today as a low mound in the desert of southern Iraq, excavated across the 20th century, and the archaeology is genuinely remarkable. 18 superimposed temples, each built directly on the ruin of the last, going down and down through the layers into the 6th millennium BC. They kept rebuilding the same building on the same spot for thousands of years, because the spot was the point. The Eridu material includes text concerning what Enki knew and where he kept it. And the fourth warning is not poetry. It is description, flat, specific and physical. Before the covering there was a country. It had rivers, and the rivers had valleys, and the valleys had names. It was walked. It was known. It was written. Then the cold came down, and the country was shut, not drowned, but shut. A drowned land is unmade. A shut land is only closed. It is still there, entire, with its rivers in their places, waiting under the cur. That is the fourth warning. Under the covering there is not wreckage. Under the covering there is a country, with river valleys, intact, exactly as it was on the day it was closed. That is a falsifiable claim. Either there is a preserved, river-carved landscape under the ice, or there isn't. Here is why that matters, and here is what happened last year. For most of the 20th century, the assumption about the bedrock under Antarctica was straightforward. It would be a mess. Ice sheets are the most effective erosive agent on the planet. A glacier is a rock-studded rasp weighing billions of tons, dragging across bedrock, grinding as it goes. 34 million years of that should produce a scoured, gouged, structureless plain. Whatever the continent looked like before the ice was assumed to be gone, not hidden, destroyed, erased. Then, in October 2023, Stuart Jameson and colleagues at Durham published in Nature Communications. Their method was not exotic, and that is precisely what makes it convincing. They took existing radio echo sounding data, decades of accumulated radar surveys flown over East Antarctica, and combined it with satellite imagery of the ice surface. Ice, it turns out, drapes. The topography kilometers below telegraphs itself faintly to the surface, in gentle undulations you would never notice from the ground but which show up from orbit. They use the surface to interpolate between the radar lines and reconstruct the terrain underneath. What they reconstructed, beneath the ice of Wilkes Land in East Antarctica, was a landscape of about 32,000 square kilometers, larger than Belgium, and it was not scoured. It was not gouged. It was organized. It had ridges. It had blocks of upland separated by valleys. And the valleys were river valleys, the branching dendritic pattern that only running water makes, the shape of a drainage system, the shape of a river and its tributaries and their tributaries, sitting under 2 kilometers of ice. The word Jameson used to the press was that it was like uncovering a fossilized landscape. He said, and this stuck with me, that it was less well known than the surface of Mars, that the reason we had never seen it was not that it was destroyed, but simply that nobody had looked in the right way. The estimate for how long that landscape has been sealed is the part that should stop you. The team's assessment is that it has been essentially untouched for somewhere on the order of 14 million years, and possibly since the ice first arrived, around 34 million years ago. 14 million years ago there were no humans of any kind. Our lineage had not separated from the other apes. The land under that ice was last rained on before anything resembling a person existed anywhere on Earth, and it is still there. Rivers in their valleys, ridges where they were left. Now hold the Eridu line against it. It had rivers, and the rivers had valleys, dendritic drainage networks, reconstructed from radar, published in a peer-reviewed journal in October 2023. Then the cold came down and the country was shut, not drowned, shut. This is the distinction the paper turns on, and I want to make sure it lands, because it is the whole thing. The reason that landscape survived is that the ice in that region does not slide. Where ice moves, it destroys. The fast-flowing outlet glaciers around the Antarctic margins have carved enormous troughs and obliterated whatever was beneath them. But in the deep interior, the base of the sheet is frozen onto the rock. It is not a rasp, it is a lid. Where the ice is frozen down, it does not erode the land, it protects it absolutely from everything. The country was not destroyed by the ice. The country was closed by the ice, and closing is not destroying. That is the fourth warning, in the language of a civilization that had never seen a glacier, and it is also the conclusion of a 2023 paper in Nature Communications. A drowned land is unmade, a shut land is only closed. I want to hold the line honestly here, as I have all the way through. I am not telling you the Sumerians saw Antarctica. There is no tablet that says Antarctica. Nobody walked that country and came back to write it down in Eridu, and the 14 million year figure makes that not merely unlikely, but flatly impossible. There was nobody to do the walking. Anyone who tells you a human being witnessed that landscape is telling you something that cannot be true. Here is what I am telling you, and I would ask you to take it exactly as strong as it is and no stronger. A civilization on a floodplain in Iraq 4,500 years ago wrote that beneath the cold place there is a country, with rivers in their valleys, that was not destroyed but shut, and that it is still there, entire, waiting. For 4,500 years there was no way on Earth to check. In October 2023, somebody checked, and under 2 kilometers of East Antarctic ice there is a country the size of Belgium, with rivers in their valleys that was not destroyed but shut, and it is still there, entire. I cannot tell you why. I have no mechanism to offer you. I'm not going to invent one, because inventing one is how this material gets ruined, and because the thing itself does not need my help. I can tell you the sentence and I can tell you the citation, and I can tell you that the sentence is older than the alphabet and the citation is from last year, and that they say the same thing. I want to slow down on how they actually did it, because the method is the reason this is convincing rather than exciting. The problem with mapping bedrock under Antarctica is that radar surveys are flown in lines. An aircraft flies a transect, and you get a profile, a slice, of what is underneath along that one path. Then you fly another line some distance away and get another slice. What happens between the lines is guesswork, and in the deep interior the lines can be tens of kilometers apart because every hour of flying costs money and risks lives. So the bedrock maps we had were real, but coarse, like trying to understand a face from 3 vertical cuts through it. The Durham insight was to use the ice surface as an interpolator. 2 kilometers of ice does not hide the shape underneath completely. It transmits it, faintly, upward. Ice flowing over a ridge produces a subtle rise. Over a valley, a subtle depression. These are gentle features, meters of relief across kilometers of distance, invisible to anyone standing on them. But satellites have been measuring the elevation of the Antarctic surface for years, at high resolution, across the whole continent. So, take the radar lines, which tell you the truth but only in slices. Take the satellite surface imagery, which covers everything but only hints. Use the hints to fill between the slices, and a landscape appeared, not a blur, not a suggestion. Ridges and valleys with the branching geometry that only rivers make, a trunk with tributaries, and tributaries on the tributaries, the fractal signature of water finding its way downhill over millions of years. 3 blocks of upland separated by valleys across an area larger than Belgium in the Aurora and Schmidt subglacial basins of East Antarctica. Jameson's line to the press was that the land beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet is less well known than the surface of Mars. Sit with that, because it is precisely true, and it is insane. We have imaged Mars to a resolution where you can pick out individual boulders. We have driven robots across it for years and photographed the tracks. There is a helicopter that flew there, and a continent on our own planet, a place our own species has stood on the edges of, that has permanent staffed bases that you could book a flight to, has an interior we understand less well than another world. The reason is not that Antarctica is far, it is that it is covered. The ice is not a distance problem, it is an opacity problem. Mars is 100 million kilometers away and it is naked. The Aurora Basin is at the bottom of our own map, and it is wearing 2 kilometers of armor, and here is the part that changes what the finding means. The team were clear that this landscape is not an anomaly. 32,000 square kilometers is simply what they could resolve in the region they chose with the data that happened to exist. East Antarctica is roughly 10 million square kilometers. They mapped about 1/3 of it. There is no reason to believe they found the only one. Every indication is the opposite, that this is a sample, that underneath the East Antarctic ice sheet there is an entire preserved surface, a whole ancient world with its own mountains and watersheds and coastal plains and river systems, sealed in the position it was in on the day the cold came down, across an area the size of the continental United States. We have looked at a patch of it the size of Belgium. We found rivers in their valleys. The other 99.7% is right there. Nobody has looked, not because it is forbidden, because it is expensive, and because the funding goes to sea level projections, and because there is no line item for find out what the world looked like before there was anyone to see it. I want to stay with Totten, because it deserves more than a paragraph and because it quietly overturns something you have almost certainly been told. Here is the thing you have been told. West Antarctica is the unstable one. East Antarctica is the safe one. It is in the textbooks. It has been the working assumption of the field for decades, and it is not stupid. East Antarctica is colossally larger, colder, older, higher, and most of it does sit on rock above sea level. If you had to bet on which half of the continent would still be there in 1,000 years, you would bet east, and you would probably be right. But most is not all, and the exceptions are where the Durham landscape lives. The Aurora subglacial basin is one of them. It is an enormous depression in the bedrock, and much of its floor is well below sea level, in places more than 1 kilometer below. The ice sitting in it is not resting on a plateau. It is sitting in a bowl that the ocean could in principle fill, and the drain on that bowl is Totten Glacier on the Sabrina coast. Totten is not famous. Thwaites got the nickname and the documentaries. Totten is on the other side of the planet from anywhere anyone goes, and it does not have a catchy name, and so almost nobody outside the field has heard of it. But Totten drains a catchment holding something like 3.5 meters of sea level equivalent, comparable to Thwaites, in the half of Antarctica nobody was worried about, and it is the fastest thinning glacier in East Antarctica. That has been clear from satellite altimetry for years. The question was why. It is far too cold there for surface melt to matter. The air over Totten does not get warm enough to melt anything, ever. The answer came from an airborne survey program called IceCap, flying instrumented aircraft over the Sabrina coast, and it was published in Nature Geoscience in 2015 by Greenbaum and colleagues. They mapped the seafloor and the bedrock in front of and beneath the glacier's floating tongue, and they found gateways, deep troughs cut into the continental shelf running inland underneath the ice. Those troughs are doors for water. The relevant water is called modified circumpolar deep water. It is not warm in any way a person would recognize. We are talking about something in the region of 0.5 degree to a couple of degrees above freezing. But the freezing point of seawater at depth is below 0, and ice does not care about your intuitions. Water at +1 degree delivered continuously against the underside of a glacier will melt it, relentlessly, forever. That water sits offshore all around Antarctica at depth. The only thing keeping it away from the ice is geometry, whether there is a path for it to get in. In most of East Antarctica there isn't. At Totten there is. 2 of them. So the picture is this. Warm water, which has always been out there, is finding its way through troughs in the seafloor, travelling inland underneath the floating ice, and eating the glacier from below at the grounding line. Exactly the Thwaites mechanism. exactly the thing we thought East Antarctica was immune to, because we had not looked at the shape of the ground. And the shape of the ground is the whole problem, because the Aurora Basin deepens inland, which means that as the grounding line retreats, it retreats into deeper water, which means more ice face exposed to the ocean, which means faster melt, which means faster retreat. The same runaway geometry that makes Thwaites frightening is present in the basin we thought was safe, underneath the ice we thought was permanent, above the country with the rivers in its valleys. I am going to be careful about the timescale, because this is exactly where this genre goes wrong. Nobody serious thinks Totten is going to collapse this century. The estimates are centuries to millennia for the large-scale retreat, and the ice is kilometres thick. Nothing I am describing means that a Miocene river valley is going to see daylight in your lifetime or your grandchildren's. It will not. But I should be straight with you about one number, because I nearly rounded it in the comfortable direction. Those upland blocks are not deep in the interior. They sit about 350 kilometres from the edge of the ice sheet. That is not far. That is Los Angeles to Las Vegas. Here is what I am telling you, and it is enough. The seal on that basin was assumed to be permanent, and it is not permanent. It is a gate, and the ocean has found the hinges, and the retreat has started, and it is measured, and it is in the literature, and it is not disputed. 14 million years the country has been shut. In the last few decades of that, a species arrived, learned to fly, learned to see through ice, found the country, and in the same region at the same time, without particularly meaning to, began levering open the thing that had kept it. We are the first thing to touch that seal since before there were apes. Gates are opened and closed and opened. So put the two halves together, because I do not think anyone has said this to you plainly. The country under the ice, the preserved landscape with rivers in its valleys, sealed for 14 million years, sits in a basin whose floor is below sea level, drained by a glacier that is thinning because the ocean has found a way in. The place where we found the intact ancient world is the same place where the lid is being levered. The two facts are in the same postcode and nobody has put them together in public, because the people who study preserve subglacial landscapes and the people who study marine ice sheet instability publish in different journals and go to different conferences and are answering different questions. One group found a country, the other group is measuring how fast the door on it is failing. They are the same door. There is a feature in that same region that I want to give you because it puts a floor under everything else in this segment. In 2019, a project called Bed Machine Antarctica published the most detailed map yet made of the rock beneath the ice. The method was elegant. Instead of just interpolating between radar lines, they used physics. Ice flow has to conserve mass, so if you know how fast ice is moving and how much is accumulating, you can solve for the shape of the container. Radar plus conservation of mass plus satellite velocity data. And in East Antarctica, beneath the Denman Glacier, they found the deepest point on any continent on this planet. The bed of Denman Canyon lies about 3.5 kilometers below sea level, not below the ice surface, below sea level. For comparison, the lowest exposed land on Earth is the shore of the Dead Sea, at about 430 meters below sea level, and it is a famous place, a place people travel to stand at. Denman is 8 times deeper, and no one has ever been there, and no one ever will. It is a trench in the continental rock, filled with ice, deeper than any canyon anywhere that is not underwater. We found it in 2019, not the 18th century, not the Victorian age of exploration. In 2019, after we had mapped Mars, after we had photographed Pluto, after we had landed a probe on a comet, we found the deepest place on land, on our own planet, and we found it by inference, and nobody has seen it. That is the actual state of our knowledge of the country under the ice. We are still finding the big things, not details, not refinements. The deepest canyon on Earth was a discovery 6 years ago, and in the same survey, in the same region as the Durham landscape, the terrain keeps resolving into structure, basins, troughs, uplands, a coastline that was a coastline before there was ice, with rivers running down into it. There is a geography down there, not a metaphor for one. An actual geography with the same kinds of features your own country has, that had weather and seasons and a horizon, and that has been closed since before our lineage had a face. Before the covering there was a country, and I can tell you one more detail from that research because it is the detail I have not been able to put down. It is still there, entire, with its rivers in their places, waiting under the Kur, mountain, foreign land, the place from which nothing returns. The Sumerians had one word for it. There is a country under the ice. It has been confirmed. It is in the literature. You can read the paper tonight. And the fifth warning is about what the country weighs. The fifth warning. The fifth warning is the shortest of the 7 and the least comfortable, and I think those two facts are related. It comes from Lagash. Lagash was a rival to Nippur and Eridu, a genuine power, a city-state that fought wars over water rights with its neighbour Umma for generations, and that produced in Gudea one of the few Sumerian rulers whose face we actually have, in a series of diorite statues that are among the finest objects to survive from the ancient world. Lagash was excavated by French teams beginning in 1877 under Ernest de Sarzec, which makes it one of the earliest Mesopotamian sites ever dug, and it produced tens of thousands of tablets, many of them administrative, the ledgers of a working bureaucracy. That is the register the fifth warning is written in. Not hymn, not lament, inventory. Weigh the Kur and it weighs too much. The mountain does not account for it. The water does not account for it. Something was set down there that was not made there. It has not moved. It is not held. It only rests. That is the fifth warning. Whatever is under the covering is heavier than it should be, and the excess is something that was put there from outside. Here is why that matters. You can weigh a continent. This sounds like a strange claim, and it is completely routine. In 2002, NASA and the German Aerospace Center launched a mission called GRACE, the Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment. It was 2 satellites flying the same orbit, about 200 kilometers apart, doing one thing: measuring the distance between each other constantly with almost absurd precision, down to about a micron, a fraction of the width of a human hair. The reason that works is simple. When the lead satellite passes over something dense, that mass pulls it forward very slightly and the gap between the two opens. When the trailing satellite reaches the same spot, it gets tugged too, and the gap closes. The distance between 2 objects in the sky is a map of the mass underneath them. Grace flew for 15 years, and its successor Grace Foe is up there right now. It has given us an extraordinary amount. It is how we know how fast the ice sheets are losing mass, because we watch them get lighter. And in 2006, a team at Ohio State led by Ralph von Friess published an analysis of Grace data over Wilkes Land in East Antarctica. They reported a mass concentration, a region roughly 300 kilometers across where the gravity signal is anomalous, where there is more mass than the known geology accounts for. And in the ice-penetrating radar over the same area, there appears to be a ring structure around it, on the order of 500 kilometers in diameter. Von Friess's interpretation was that it is an impact crater, a very large one, larger than the Chicxulub structure that ended the Cretaceous, and his team suggested a date of roughly 250 million years ago, which is a provocative number, because 250 million years ago is the Permian-Triassic boundary, the Great Dying, the worst extinction event in the history of life on this planet, when something like 9 in every 10 marine species stopped existing. The cause of that event is still argued about, now. I have been straight with you all the way through this, and I am not going to stop here. Von Friess's interpretation is not accepted. It has been contested since publication, and it remains contested. The objections are substantial. The structure is under kilometers of ice, so nobody has ever sampled it. There is no shocked quartz, no impact melt, none of the physical evidence that establishes an impact crater anywhere else. Gravity anomalies have other perfectly ordinary explanations. A dense intrusion of igneous rock, a chunk of mantle material sitting high, an artifact of how the crust is structured. The Permian-Triassic link in particular is regarded by most specialists as speculation running well ahead of the data. So, the crater is not established. If somebody has told you there is a confirmed impact structure under Wilkes Land, they have overstated it, and I am not going to overstate it to you. Here is what is not in dispute. The gravity anomaly is real. The data is real. There is a region of East Antarctica where there is more mass than the surrounding geology explains, and after nearly 20 years, we do not have an agreed account of what it is. That is the actual situation. Not a conspiracy. Not a cover-up. Just an open question that nobody can close, because closing it would require drilling through 2 kilometers of ice in the most remote place on Earth to sample rock that has not been touched since before the dinosaurs, and no one has found the hundreds of millions of dollars that would take. There is something down there that is heavier than the model predicts. We have measured it from orbit. We do not know what it is. Weigh the Kerr and it weighs too much. The mountain does not account for it. The water does not account for it. That is not a claim about impacts. Read it again. It is a claim about accounting. It says, when you total up what you know is under there, the sum comes out short of what you measure. There is a discrepancy between the inventory and the weight. That is precisely, exactly, the situation in Wilkes Land. Not metaphorically, literally. The known geology does not account for the observed mass. There is a gap in the ledger, and Lagash was a city of ledgers. These were people whose civilization ran on reconciling what was recorded against what was actually in the storehouse. When a Sumerian scribe wrote that something does not account for the weight, he was not reaching for a poetic image. He was using the most concrete vocabulary he had. He was saying, the count is wrong. Something was set down there that was not made there. I'm not going to tell you what it is because I do not know, and neither does anyone else, and anyone claiming otherwise is telling you a story. To understand why the Wilkes Land claim landed the way it did, you need to know what it was being compared to. Chicxulub is the crater under the Yucatan, and it is the most consequential hole in the ground we know of. Roughly 180 kilometers across, 66 million years old. An object something like 10 kilometers wide arrived at a speed that made the physics of rock irrelevant, and the impact ended the reign of the dinosaurs and cleared the stage for the mammals, which is to say for us. Every person who has ever lived exists because of a bad afternoon in the Gulf of Mexico, and we are certain about Chicxulub, not because of gravity data, although the anomaly is how it was first noticed by oil company geophysicists in the 1970s who thought it was a geological curiosity and filed it. We are certain because we have the rock, cores through the structure, shocked quartz, quartz whose crystal lattice has been deformed by pressures that only occur in impacts and nuclear detonations, a worldwide layer of iridium, an element rare in Earth's crust and common in asteroids, laid down in the sediments at exactly the right moment on every continent. Tektites, melt sheets, a ring of cenotes in the Yucatan tracing the rim, which the Maya used for water for centuries without knowing what they were drinking from. That is what a confirmed impact structure looks like. Multiple independent lines of physical evidence sampled, dated, replicated. Wilkes Land has a gravity anomaly and a radar ring. That is it. That is everything. You cannot get shocked quartz from a gravity map. You cannot date a mass concentration. Every physical test that made Chicxulub a fact rather than a hypothesis requires touching the rock, and the rock is under 2 kilometers of ice in the least accessible region of the least accessible continent. So when von Fries's team suggested this was a crater larger than Chicxulub and linked it to the Permian-Triassic extinction, they were making a claim they had no way to test, and their critics knew it. And the Permian-Triassic is worth understanding because it is the reason people wanted this to be true. Chicxulub gets the attention, but the Great Dying, 252 million years ago, was worse by an order of magnitude. Something like 96% of marine species stopped existing, 70% of terrestrial vertebrates. It is the only mass extinction that seriously hurt insects. Life took perhaps 10 million years to recover in any real sense, and the world that emerged was so different that we mark it as a separate era of the planet's existence, and we do not know for certain what did it. The leading account involves the Siberian traps, an eruption of a scale that has no modern comparison. Flood basalts covering millions of square kilometers, burning through coal deposits, dumping carbon into the atmosphere over hundreds of thousands of years, acidifying the oceans, stripping the ozone. That account has a great deal of evidence behind it, and most specialists find it sufficient. But the idea that the worst day in the history of life had a cause we could point at, a crater, a moment, a thing that arrived, has enormous narrative gravity. It is emotionally satisfying in a way that a slow volcanic poisoning is not. And that, I suspect, is the actual reason the Wilkes crater story spread the way it did, and why you may have heard it presented as settled. It is not settled. I want to be as clear as I can. There is no confirmed impact structure under Wilkes Land. There may never be one, because confirming it would require an operation nobody has costed seriously, and nobody's going to fund. Think about the funding for a moment, because it explains more than any conspiracy would. Antarctic science budgets are finite, and they are overwhelmingly pointed at sea level. That is not a scandal, it is a rational allocation. Hundreds of millions of people live near coastlines, and the question of how fast West Antarctica is going to come apart is the single most consequential question in Earth science. Thwaites got its instruments because Thwaites might flood Miami. That is why the money existed. Drilling 2 kilometers into the East Antarctic interior to sample a gravity anomaly would cost an enormous sum and would tell us nothing whatsoever about sea level. It would tell us what happened 250 million years ago. There is no constituency for that. There is no city that gets saved. So it does not happen, and the anomaly sits there, unexplained for decades, not because anyone is hiding it, but because knowing would cost money and nobody would benefit in a way a budget committee recognizes. The count is wrong. We know the count is wrong. We have decided we cannot afford to find out why. There is a bitter symmetry to the 5th warning that I want to leave you with. The satellites that found the extra weight under Wilkes Land are the same satellites that are now measuring how much weight Antarctica is losing. That is what Grace mostly does, not hunting for buried anomalies. That was a side result. Its day job is watching the ice sheets get lighter, because a shrinking ice sheet is a shrinking mass, and a shrinking mass tugs a satellite less, and the gap between 2 spacecraft opens slightly less than it did last year. And the numbers it returns are not ambiguous. Antarctica has been losing mass for the whole of the mission's life. The rate is in the region of 150 billion tons a year, and the trend across the record is upward. The losses in the last decade run well ahead of the losses in the first. Greenland is worse. So the same instrument, in the same orbit, using the same physics, tells us 2 things at once. It tells us there is more mass under Wilkes Land than the geology accounts for, and it tells us that the continent as a whole is getting lighter, quickly, and that we are the reason. We have chosen to fund the second question and not the first, and that is, I want to stress, the correct choice. The second question is about whether 100 million people keep their homes. The first question is about a rock. But the ledger stays open, the count stays wrong, and it will stay wrong indefinitely, not because of any mystery, but because there is no line in any budget on Earth for find out what is under there, and there probably never will be. Weigh the cur and it weighs too much. We weighed it. It does. We have known for 20 years, and we are going to keep not knowing why, and nobody is hiding anything. That, I think, is stranger than a conspiracy. A conspiracy would at least mean somebody cared. But I want you to notice how little of the 5th warning depends on the answer. Whatever is under Wilkes Land, impact, intrusion, mantle, something we have not thought of. The Sumerian sentence is already true. There is more weight beneath the cur than the mountain and the water account for. We measured it with satellites. The count is wrong. It has not moved. It is not held. It only rests. For now. Because the 6th warning is about the fact that none of this is as still as it looks. The 6th warning. Everything so far has rested on an assumption so obvious that I have not questioned it, and neither, I suspect, have you. The assumption is that the ice is permanent, that the covering is a settled fact, that whatever is under there in the way that a fossil is in a rock, sealed by geology, on geological terms and not our problem. The 6th warning is that the covering is not a fact, it is a state, and states change. The 6th warning is the most famous Sumerian text in the world, and almost nobody knows it is about this. It is called Inanna's Descent to the Netherworld. It is one of the great works of world literature, recovered principally from Nippur, reconstructed across the 20th century by Samuel Noah Kramer from tablets scattered between Philadelphia and Istanbul. A labour of decades, piecing together a poem from fragments held on 2 continents. You can read the full translation online for free tonight. It is not hidden. It never was. The story. Inanna, Queen of Heaven, decides to go down into the Kyr. She dresses in her full regalia, crown, jewellery, robe, the works, and she goes down, and she meets a gate. At the gate she is stopped, and something is taken from her, her crown, and she asks why, and she is told, "Be silent, Inanna. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned." And then there is another gate, and another thing is taken. There are 7 gates. At each one she is stripped of one more thing, the crown, the rod, the beads, the breastplate, the ring, the garment, until she arrives at the bottom naked with nothing, and is killed and hung on a hook. 7 gates, 7 removals, and this is the line that should hold you. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned. The Kyr has a procedure. It is not chaos down there. It is not a pit. It is a system, with stages, with a sequence, with rules that are applied consistently to a goddess exactly as they would be to anyone. The Sumerians did not imagine the underworld as a wilderness. They imagined it as an administration. The sixth warning is drawn from the same tradition. The Kur is not shut with a stone. It is shut with gates. A stone is a fact. A gate is a decision. Gates are opened and closed and opened. Count the gates and know the hour. That is the sixth warning. What holds the underworld closed is not a permanent seal. It is a mechanism, and a mechanism that closes is a mechanism that opens. Here is why that matters, and this is the point where the science stops being about deep time and starts being about this decade. Go back to the 400 subglacial lakes. For a while after Vostok, the mental model was static. Pockets of ancient water, sealed, isolated, each one its own little sarcophagus. Then, in 2007, Helen Amanda Fricker and colleagues published in Science using data from IceSat, a satellite that measures the elevation of the ice surface with a laser. They found that the surface of the ice was moving, not flowing, rising and falling. Areas of West Antarctica were sagging by meters over a couple of years, and then, elsewhere, other areas were rising. The lakes were draining and filling. Water was moving from one to another, under kilometers of ice, in volumes large enough to make the entire surface of the continent visibly sink and swell from orbit. One of the systems they identified moved on the order of 2 cubic kilometers of water in about 3 years. That is not a sealed vault. That is plumbing. There is an active hydrological system under Antarctica. Reservoirs, channels, drainage events, water going somewhere and then somewhere else. And we only found out because we happened to point a laser at the roof and notice it breathing. Gates are opened and closed and opened. And then there is Thwaites. Thwaites Glacier is in West Antarctica, and it is about the size of Britain. The press calls it the Doomsday Glacier, which is tabloid, but the underlying concern is not. Thwaites sits on bedrock that is below sea level and slopes downward inland, which means that as the grounding line, the boundary where ice stops resting on rock and starts floating, retreats backward, it retreats into deeper water, which drives faster retreat, which pushes it into deeper water still. It is a geometry with a runaway built into it. Between 2019 and 2023, the International Thwaites Glacier Collaboration got instruments in there. They melted a borehole through nearly 600 meters of ice and lowered down a robot called IceFin, and for the first time anyone looked at the underside of a major glacier at its grounding line. The findings were published in Nature in 2023, and they were not what anyone expected. The flat undersides were melting more slowly than the model said. But the ice was not flat. It was cut with crevasses and terraces and stairs, and in those cracks where warm water could get in and swirl, melting was dramatically faster. The heat was not attacking the surface. It was getting into the structure and working from inside. The grounding line is not a wall. It is not a stone. It is a boundary that moves, that gets levered open along the seams it already has. The Kur is not shut with a stone. It is shut with gates. A stone is a fact. A gate is a decision. I want to be exact about what I am claiming, because this is where somebody could accuse me of something, and I would rather they couldn't. I am not telling you that Sumerian scribes knew about the Thwaites grounding line. Obviously not. I am telling you that they made a distinction that we did not make until about 15 years ago, and that we were wrong for a century for lack of it. Our model was the stone, sealed, static, permanent, geological, not our problem. Their model was the gate, a closure that's maintained, that has stages, that can be counted, that is a decision rather than a fact. We were wrong. They were right. The ice is a gate. It is opening. We are watching it open with lasers and robots, and we have footage. And the ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned, stops reading like superstition the moment you understand it correctly. It is not saying the Kur is holy. It is saying the Kur is procedural. It does not negotiate. It does not care who you are. Inanna arrives as the Queen of Heaven, and the gates take her crown anyway, because the sequence applies to everyone equally, and the sequence does not care. Physics does not negotiate either. Thwaites will not make an exception. The grounding line will retreat at the rate the geometry dictates, and no one's importance will alter it by a meter. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned. I want to tell you the descent properly, because the summary does not convey what kind of document this is. Inanna is not a minor figure. She is the most important goddess in the Sumerian world. Love and war both, which the Sumerians did not consider a contradiction. The planet Venus, the Queen of Heaven, and she decides, for reasons the text never fully explains, to go down. She is careful about it. She dresses in 7 items, and each one is named: the crown of the plain, the small beads at her neck, the twin egg-shaped beads at her breast, the breastplate, the gold ring on her wrist, the measuring rod and line in her hand, the robe. 7 objects, 7 pieces of office. And before she goes, she instructs her servant Ninchubur, "If I do not come back in 3 days, go to the gods, one after another, and beg them to save me." She knows this may not go well. She goes anyway. At the outer gate, she tells the gatekeeper to open it. He asks who she is. She lies. She says she's going to attend a funeral. He goes to check with Ereshkigal. Ereshkigal is the queen of the underworld. She is also Inanna's sister, and this is the detail that makes the whole thing sit differently. The Kur is not run by a monster. It is run by family. The text gives Ereshkigal a reaction that is startlingly physical. She slaps her thigh, she bites her lip, she takes the matter into her heart. She's not gloating, she's disturbed, and she gives an instruction: let her in. But bolt the 7 gates, and open each one only a crack, and at each one take something. At the first gate the crown is removed. Inanna asks, "What is this?" And she is told, "Be silent, Inanna. The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned." At the second gate the beads. "Be silent, Inanna." The 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, the 7th. Each time she asks, each time she gets the same answer, and it is not an answer at all. It is a wall. The most powerful goddess in existence asks why, and the underworld tells her the question is not admissible. She arrives at the bottom naked and bowed low. The 7 judges of the Kur, the Anunnaki, fix her with the eye of death, and she is killed, and her corpse is hung on a hook on the wall, and it rots there. That is the middle of the story, and I want you to notice what has happened. Not a battle, not a punishment for a crime. She has not done anything wrong. She simply went down and the procedure ran, and the procedure does not adapt to whom it is running on. That is what the ways of the underworld are perfect means. Not perfect as in good, perfect as in complete, as in there are no exceptions, and there is no clause covering you, and your importance is not an input. The reconstruction of that poem is its own story of gates and patience. Samuel Noah Kramer spent decades on it. The tablets from Nippur had been split between Philadelphia and Istanbul in the 1890s, which meant that the top of a column might be in Pennsylvania and the bottom of the same column in Turkey, and nobody knew, because nobody had seen both. Kramer travelled. He copied tablets by hand in Istanbul and carried the copies to Philadelphia and laid them beside the fragments there, looking for joins. Pieces of a single poem separated by an ocean for half a century, in collections catalogued by different people in different languages, and a man matched them up by eye. It took most of a working life, and the text we have now, the one you can read tonight for free, translated, annotated on a university website, exists because one person spent 40 years putting a broken thing back together across 2 continents. There are still gaps. There are lines we do not have. There are tablets in that collection that have not been read, and there may well be pieces of this poem among them, sitting in a drawer, catalogued and unopened, because there are not enough people who can read them, and there is no money to hire more. I want to give Samuel Noah Kramer a proper hearing, because the way we came to have any of these texts at all is itself the 7th warning in miniature. Kramer was born in Ukraine in 1897 and brought to Philadelphia as a small child fleeing pogroms. He came to Sumerian late and sideways, without a plan, and ended up at the University of Pennsylvania, which happened to be sitting on the largest collection of Sumerian literary tablets in the world. The 30,000 pulled out of Nippur in the 1890s, and almost nobody had read them. This is the thing that is difficult to convey. The tablets were not lost. They were in the building. They were in drawers with numbers on them, in a museum that had paid to dig them up and ship them across an ocean. And they sat there for 40 years, essentially unread, because reading them was slow and hard, and there were about 4 people in the world who could do it, and they all had other jobs. Kramer decided to read them, all of them. The problem was the split. When Nippur was excavated, the finds were divided between Philadelphia and the Ottoman authorities, and Istanbul got roughly half, which meant that a single tablet, broken in antiquity into 3 pieces, might have 1 piece in Pennsylvania and 2 in Turkey, and there was no way to know, because nobody had ever laid the 2 collections side by side. The catalogues were in different languages. The numbering systems were unrelated. There was no photograph of most of it. So Kramer went to Istanbul in the 1930s, and he sat in the museum and copied tablets by hand, drawing the wedges sign by sign for months, and then carried his drawings back to Philadelphia and laid them against the fragments there, looking for joins, looking for the moment when the bottom of a column in his notebook continued into the top of a column in a drawer 4,000 miles away. He found them, over and over, for decades. Inanna's Descent, the poem with the 7 gates, is a Kramer reconstruction, assembled from fragments on 2 continents over roughly 20 years. He published a version, then found more pieces, then published a better one, then more pieces. The text got longer and truer over his working life, the way a photograph comes up in a developing tray. He wrote a book in 1956 called History Begins at Sumer, which was a list of 39 things the Sumerians did first. The first schools, the first proverbs, the first love song, the first library catalogue, the first case of juvenile delinquency, which is a real tablet in which a father despairs about his son. It was a bestseller. It is the single reason most people who have heard of the Sumerians have heard of them. He worked until he was 93. Now hold that against what we have. Everything in this video that comes from a tablet reaches you because a man spent a working lifetime matching broken clay across an ocean, by eye, because nobody else was going to. Not a team, not a machine. One person with a notebook going back and forth to Istanbul, and he did not get through it. Nobody has. There are still tablets in that collection that have never been read. Pieces that might join something, that might complete a poem, that might contain a line nobody has seen in 4,000 years, sitting in a drawer 80 meters from where Kramer sat. The Kur is not shut with a stone. It is shut with gates. The gate on the Sumerian world is not locked. There is no conspiracy holding it. It is standing open, and there is simply nobody walking through it, because the funding is gone and the chairs are being cut, and a young person who wants to spend their life doing what Kramer did will be advised kindly by people who love them to do something else. Count the gates, and know the hour. The 7th warning is what happens when you count the 7th warning. The 7th warning is not about the ice. It is about the fact that the Sumerians counted, and about what they counted in, and about what happens when you notice that their numbers and the ice are keeping the same time. Start with something so ordinary you have never thought about it. You looked at a clock today. It had 60 minutes in an hour and 60 seconds in a minute. You looked at a compass or a map or a protractor at some point in your life, and it had 360 degrees in it. Nobody chose those numbers recently. Nobody voted. They are Sumerian. That arithmetic is between 4,000 and 5,000 years old, and it is running, right now, on the device you are listening to this on. The Sumerians counted in base 60. It is called the sexagesimal system, and it is genuinely superior to ours for the thing they used it for, because 60 divides cleanly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20 and 30. 10 divides by 2 and 5 and then it gives up. If you spend your life splitting land, water and grain into fractions, 60 is the better number, and they knew it, and we still use it for angles and time because nobody has ever come up with a good enough reason to stop. Their system had named units. 60 was a guess, 600 was a guess you, and 3,600 was a shah. 3,600 had its own sign, a single mark, not 60 60s, one symbol, one word, one thing. 60 squared, treated as a fundamental quantity at the base of the world's first number system. Now, the Sumerian king list, the artifact at the Ashmolean I mentioned earlier. Its opening section lists kings who ruled before the flood, and it gives their reigns, and it gives them in Shah. Alulim of Eridu, 8 Shah. Alalgar, 10 Shah. The numbers run to totals that in years are absurd. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. Every serious scholar reads those figures as symbolic, and I think they're almost certainly right. These are not payroll records. They are a way of saying before, of marking the pre-flood world as belonging to a different order of time entirely. But notice what the Sumerians reached for when they wanted to express deep time. Not a big number, a unit. They did not say, a very long while ago. They counted the abyss in blocks of 3,600, as though duration on that scale had a natural grain to it, as though time, past a certain depth, came in cycles rather than in amounts. The seventh warning comes from that tradition, and it is the last one, and it is the only one addressed to the listener directly. The Kur keeps its own count and does not tell it. What is shut for a number, and the number is running. You are not told the number, you are told to count. Count, and be standing when the count comes out. Here is why that matters. The most important thing on Earth for understanding the deep past is not a tablet, or a fossil, or a ruin. It is a column of ice. When snow falls on the Antarctic interior, it does not melt. It is buried by the next snow, and the next compressed into ice. And it takes with it a sample of the atmosphere on the day it fell. Actual air, sealed in bubbles. Drill down, and you're not reading a proxy. You are pulling out the sky, in order, layer by layer, going back. The Vostok core reached about 400,000 years. The Epica core at Domesea reached about 800,000. There is a project drilling right now, beyond Epica, that is going after 1.5 million, and when you lay that record out, it is not noise. It is a waveform. The ice advances and retreats in a rhythm. Cold, then warm, then cold, then warm, and the beat is regular enough that you can set your watch by it. Roughly every 100,000 years, a glacial cycle. And nested inside, faster components. About 41,000 years, about 23,000 years. Those numbers are not random, and we know exactly where they come from. They are the Earth's orbit. The shape of our orbit stretches and relaxes on about 100,000 years. The tilt of our axis nods between roughly 22.1 and 24.5 degrees on about 41,000. And the axis itself swings in a slow circle, precession, on about 26,000 years, which slides the seasons around the orbit. Milutin Milankovitch worked this out in the early 20th century, sitting in a prison camp during the First World War, and he was mostly ignored, and then in 1976 a paper in Science laid the ocean sediment record against his predictions, and the frequencies matched, and the argument was over. The ice ages are clockwork. The covering over the Kur is on a timer, and the timer is the solar system. The Kur keeps its own count and does not tell it. What is shut for a number, and the number is running. Here is where I have to be most careful, because this is where this material is most often abused. There is a well-known claim that attaches the number 3,600 to an orbital period, a hidden body on a long ellipse returning on schedule. You have almost certainly encountered it. It is not supported. It does not come from the tablets. It comes from a 20th century author reading them in a way Assyriologists do not accept, and there is no astronomical evidence for the object. I am not going to hand it to you, because it is not true, and because you deserve better than to be handed something that is not true. The Shah is a number. It is 60 squared. It is an artifact of counting in base 60, and that is a complete and sufficient explanation of why it exists. So let me tell you the thing that is actually strange, which does not need any of that. The Sumerians built a number system on 60, and 60 is the number that describes the sky. 360 degrees, a circle divided into a number that is very nearly the days in a year, which is not a coincidence, because they were tracking the sun's path against the stars and dividing it up. 60 minutes in a degree. Their arithmetic was not abstract. It was cut to fit the heavens, because the heavens were the only clock they had, and it fit so well that 4,500 years later, an astronomer with a telescope worth $1 billion still writes coordinates in degrees, minutes, and seconds in Sumerian. Now consider what Milankovitch actually discovered. He discovered that the ice is controlled by the geometry of the sky: tilt, wobble, orbit. The covering over the Kur opens and closes according to angles. The Sumerians built a number system to measure angles in the sky, and used the same system to count the depth of the past. To them, the sky and the abyss were both counted in 60s. They were not separate subjects, they were one subject, and they were right. The angles in the sky are the count of the abyss. That is not mysticism. That is a 1976 paper in Science. We separated those questions. We put astronomy in one building and geology in another, and made the students take different degrees. The first civilization to write anything down never made that split, and on this specific question, the split was the error. You were not told the number. You were told to count. Milankovitch's story deserves telling because of where he did the work. He was a Serbian engineer and mathematician, and in 1914 he had the poor timing to be on honeymoon in his home village when the First World War started. He was arrested by Austro-Hungarian forces almost immediately and put in a prison at Osijek, and in the cell he had his briefcase. In the briefcase were his papers. He later wrote about the first night, that he looked at the papers, took out his pen and started working, and that after a while he stopped noticing the cell entirely. He was eventually moved to Budapest under a kind of loose internment, where a colleague arranged for him to work at the library of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. He spent 4 years of a world war doing arithmetic, and what he calculated was the shape of the Earth's motion. Not roughly, precisely. He worked out how the eccentricity of our orbit changes over roughly 100,000 years, how the tilt of our axis nods between about 22.1 and 24.5 degrees over roughly 41,000, how the axis precesses in a slow circle over roughly 26,000. And then he calculated how much sunlight those changes deliver to specific latitudes in specific seasons, across hundreds of thousands of years, by hand, without a machine, in wartime. He concluded that summer insolation at high northern latitudes was the trigger for ice ages, that what matters is not how cold the winter is, but whether the previous winter's snow survives the summer. And he was ignored for 50 years, not attacked. Worse, dismissed as a curiosity. The geological evidence at the time was too coarse to test him with, and the idea that something as vast as an ice age could be controlled by a wobble seemed to belong to a different category of thinking altogether. He died in 1958 without knowing whether he had been right. Then we learned to read the ocean floor. In 1976, Hayes, Imbrie and Shackleton published in Science a paper on cores from the southern Indian Ocean. Sediment on the seabed accumulates continuously, and it contains the shells of tiny organisms, and the oxygen isotope ratios in those shells record how much of the world's water was locked up in ice at the time the creature died. It is a thermometer with a date stamp running for hundreds of thousands of years. They ran the frequencies, and the record had peaks at roughly 100,000 years, roughly 41,000 years, and roughly 23,000 years. Milankovitch's numbers, coming out of mud at the bottom of the ocean, half a century after a prisoner of war calculated them from the geometry of the sky. The paper was titled with the phrase, "Pacemaker of the Ice Ages," and the argument was effectively over. The ice on this planet is driven by the angles of our orbit. It is not weather, it is clockwork, and the clock is astronomical. And then the ice itself confirmed it, from the inside. The Vostok core gave us 400,000 years of atmosphere. The European effort at Dome C, Epica, reached about 800,000, a continuous record of the sky, in order going back 8 times longer than our species has existed. And there it is again, the sawtooth. Slow slide into glaciation, abrupt snap back into warmth, over and over, locked to the orbital beat. Right now, a project called Beyond Epica is drilling at a site called Little Dome C, going after ice 1.5 million years old. They are hunting a specific mystery. About 1 million years ago, the rhythm changed. The cycle switched from a 41,000-year beat to a 100,000-year beat, and nobody knows why. The orbital forcing did not change. The response did. The answer, if it exists anywhere, is in the ice. They are drilling for it now, this season, while you are listening to this. So consider what the Antarctic ice sheet actually is. It is the lid over the Kür. It is the covering. It is the thing that shut the country with its rivers in their valleys and has kept it entire for 14 million years. And it is also the record of its own timing. The lid is the clock. Drill into the thing that did the covering and it tells you layer by layer exactly when it came and went and came back for 800,000 years in a rhythm set by the tilt of the world. The Sumerians counted the abyss in 60s, and 60 is the number they cut to fit the sky. They put the sky and the abyss in the same arithmetic. So did the Earth. The ice core record deserves one more minute, because I do not think most people have understood what it physically is. When you pull a core out of the Antarctic ice sheet, you are holding a cylinder about 10 centimeters across. It is cold, and it is clear, and near the bottom it is under so much pressure that when you bring it up, it can fracture explosively as the trapped gas expands. Cores from great depth have to be left to relax for months before anyone can work on them. And inside that cylinder are bubbles. The bubbles are air, not a proxy for air, not an inference about air. Actual atmosphere, nitrogen, oxygen, argon, carbon dioxide, methane, that was in the sky on a particular day, that got buried by the next snowfall, and has been sitting in the dark ever since waiting for someone to open it. Crack one under a mass spectrometer, and you are smelling a specific Tuesday from 400,000 years ago. That is the Epica record. 800,000 years of continuous atmosphere in order from a single hole at Dome Sea. 8 glacial cycles, every one of them showing the same sawtooth, a long, ragged 100,000-year slide into cold, and then a fast snap back into warmth over a few thousand years, over and over, locked to the orbit, and the CO2 curve inside it moves in lockstep with the temperature curve, all the way down for 800,000 years, never once breaking out of a band. The lows around 180 parts per million, the highs around 300, up and down, 8 times, within that band, for longer than our species has existed. We are currently over 420. That is not a projection or a model. That is a measurement of the air outside right now, held against a direct physical sample of the air for the last 800,000 years. The band has been broken. There is nothing in the ice that looks like this. And beyond Epica is drilling right now for the ice that goes back 1.5 million years, chasing the moment the rhythm changed. The transition, about 1 million years ago, when the beat shifted from 41,000 years to 100,000, and nobody knows why. The orbit did not change. The response did. Something in the system reorganized itself, and the record of it is frozen in a hole in East Antarctica, and there is a team on the ice this season trying to reach it. The covering is the clock. The clock is also the archive. And we are the first generation with the tools to read it, arriving at the exact moment the thing it records is being broken. The Kerr keeps its own count and does not tell it. There is a part of the ice record I've not told you about, and it is the part that keeps the people who work on it awake. The orbital cycles are slow, 100,000 years, 41,000, 26,000. On those timescales, nothing happens in a human life, and the whole framework has a reassuring, geological not-my-problem quality to it. But when you look closely at the ice cores, particularly the Greenland cores, which have finer annual resolution than the Antarctic ones, the record is not smooth between the big cycles. It is full of spikes. They are called Dansgaard-Yushka events, after the Danish and Swiss scientists who found them, and there are something like 25 of them in the last glacial period alone, and what they show is temperature jumping, by something in the range of 8 to 15 degrees Celsius over Greenland, not over millennia, over decades. In some cases, the transition appears to take place in a span of years. Read that again, because it took the field a long time to accept it, and the resistance was not stupidity. It was that the result seemed impossible. The climate system was understood to be sluggish. It has enormous thermal mass. It should not be able to move like that. It moved like that, repeatedly, 25 times. And the mechanism, as best it is understood, involves ice. Great armadas of icebergs breaking off the northern ice sheets and dumping fresh water into the North Atlantic, choking the circulation that carries heat north. Those are the Heinrich events, and you can see them in the ocean sediment as layers of rock debris that could only have been rafted there by ice. So the picture that emerges from the cores is not clockwork after all, or rather, it is clockwork with a trigger. The orbital cycles set the conditions slowly, over tens of thousands of years, loading the system. And then, when the conditions are right, something small tips it, and it does not shift gradually. It snaps. The count runs slow. What the count is counting toward happens fast. What is shut for a number, and the number is running. Count and be standing when the count comes out. I have been careful all the way through this, and I am not going to spoil it now. That Sumerian line is not a prophecy. It does not name a date. It does not tell you what happens. And the honest reading of it, the one an Assyriologist would give you, is that it is about mortality, that it is a scribe telling a listener that the underworld has a schedule for everyone and you would be wise to live as though yours is running, which it is. That is what it means. I believe that is what it means. But notice that the ice does the same thing. Notice that the structure is identical, a long, slow count that nobody is told, and then an ending that arrives faster than anything in the count suggested it would. The Sumerians did not know about Dansgaard-Oeschger events. They knew that things which have been the same for a very long time do not stay the same forever, and that when they stop suddenly, and that the fact you were not warned is not the same as there having been no warning. They wrote it down. It is in Philadelphia. It has been there since 1900. So let me tell you where the count stands honestly, because this is the last thing and it should be true. By the orbital arithmetic alone, we are in an interglacial, a warm gap, and the next glacial phase should be a long way off. Some modelling suggests the current configuration was always going to give us an unusually long one, but the ice is not doing what the orbital arithmetic says. It is losing mass at a rate that is measured by grace, by the same satellites that weighed Wilkes Land watching the continent get lighter. Thwaites' grounding line is retreating and we have been down there and looked at why. The lakes are draining and filling and we can see the roof breathe from orbit. The clock is running. It is not running to the schedule the sky set. Count and be standing when the count comes out. Let me put down what we actually have without any of the ornament, because after 2 hours you are owed a plain accounting. A civilization on a flat floodplain, 4,500 years ago, had one word for the mountain, the far country, and the land of the dead. That is a fact of the lexicon, and it is not disputed. They said beneath that place there is water that does not freeze and does not move and is being kept. There is 2.5 miles down, at -3 degrees, liquid, still, sealed for 15 million years, and 400 more like it. They said the mountain beneath is not worn away because being covered is not the same as being destroyed. It isn't. The Gamburtsevs are down there at full height with their river valleys intact, preserved by the very thing that was supposed to have erased them. They said what is given whole was made elsewhere, and the maker is not in the copy. In Istanbul there is a map drawn from 20 sources that no longer exist anywhere on Earth. They said beneath the covering there is a country, with rivers in their valleys, shut and not drowned, still entire. Last year in Nature Communications somebody found it. 32,000 square kilometers. Rivers in their valleys, sealed 14 million years, and that is 1/3 of 1% of what is down there. They said the count is wrong, that the Kerr weighs more than the mountain and the water account for. It does. We measured it from orbit, and after 20 years we still cannot say what the extra weight is. They said the covering is not a stone but a gate, and gates open. It is, and it is opening, and we have sent a robot down to watch it happen. And they said the whole thing is on a count kept in the sky that nobody will tell you, and so learn to count. I am not going to tell you what that means. I have tried very hard for 2 hours not to tell you what anything means, because the moment I do, this becomes a story I am selling you rather than a set of facts you're holding. Every scientific claim here is published, cited and checkable, and I have told you every time the interpretation is contested, because the contested ones are contested for good reasons and you should know which is which. There is no tablet that says Antarctica. Nobody walked that country. The map is South America bent to fit the hide. The crater is not confirmed. The returning planet is not real. And after you strip out every single one of the things that isn't true, after you throw out the whole apparatus of people who wanted this to be more exciting than it is, what is left is still this. The oldest words in the world describe a place under the cold, and the place is there. Nobody has explained that. Not properly. The explanations on offer are that it is coincidence, or that it is pattern matching, or that ancient people were describing something else entirely, and we are reading our own preoccupations into their clay. Those explanations may be right. Coincidence is real, and the human mind is a pattern-finding engine that does not know when to stop, and I would be lying if I claimed to have ruled it out. But there is one more possibility, and it costs nothing to sit with, and it is the one the Sumerians themselves stated plainly, and we have never taken seriously. They said they did not work it out. They said it was given to them. Finished. by somebody they could not see and that they did not know how the giver knew. That is not a boast. Read it again. It is the opposite of a boast. It is the first civilization on Earth saying, this isn't ours. We're keeping it. We don't know where it came from. We decided that was mythology, because the alternative was inconvenient, and because we had already decided what ancient people were capable of before we read a word they wrote. So the words sat in museums in Philadelphia and Istanbul and Jena for 140 years, catalogued, translated, published, free to read, describing a country under the ice with rivers in its valleys, and in October 2023, we found the country. Let me leave you with a number, because it is the only thing I have that I think might actually change what you do tomorrow. The tablets are not rare. That is the assumption everyone makes, and it is completely wrong. When people imagine cuneiform, they imagine something precious and scarce, a handful of objects under glass, pored over by the world's experts, every line wrung dry. The best estimates put the number of cuneiform tablets sitting in museum and university collections around the world at something in the region of 500,000. 500,000. And the proportion that has been published, properly read, translated, made available, is, by most reckonings, somewhere around 10%. So there are right now on shelves in Philadelphia and Istanbul and London and Berlin and Jena and Baghdad and New Haven, hundreds of thousands of documents from the first civilization on Earth that no living person has read, catalogued, numbered, in drawers. Nobody has looked at them, not because they are secret, because there is nobody to do it. The number of people alive who can read Sumerian fluently is very small. Small enough that they know each other, small enough that the loss of any one of them is a measurable loss to the species. It is not a career with a growth curve. The positions are few, and they are being cut. A person who wants to spend their life reading the oldest words humans ever wrote will spend a decade training, and then compete for a post that may not exist by the time they are ready for it. Meanwhile, the tablets sit, and they are not stable. Clay is fragile, salts migrate, storage fails, and the region where most of them came from has spent the last several decades being fought over, which is why some of the material that was in Baghdad in 2003 is not anywhere now. There is a project called the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative that is trying, photographing, cataloguing, putting it online, free, for anyone. It is a small operation doing an enormous job. You can go and look at the images tonight at no cost, and you will be looking at photographs of documents that nobody has translated. So here is where we actually are. The oldest civilization on Earth wrote down what was under the cold place. We found the tablets 140 years ago and we put them in drawers. We read 1/10 of them. We decided the rest was mythology before we finished reading it. And in October 2023, we pointed a satellite at Antarctica and found a country with rivers in its valleys, exactly where they said it was. 90% of what they wrote has never been read. The Kerr keeps its own count and does not tell it. You were not told the number. You were told to count.